Hello, and thank you for choosing this clean historical Western romance by Emma Ashwood. Before we begin, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Your support allows us to keep sharing more wonderful stories for free. So grab a cozy spot, kick back, and let this story whisk you away to a different time and place. Enjoy. Copyright Emma Ashwood. The No Hope Brides by Emma Ashwood. Chapter 1, February 14th, 1880, New York City. It was Valentine's Day, but strangely, Holly James was glad of the black veil that covered her face. She felt that it offered her some form of protection against the sickness that was killing the people of the city. Over the last 3 weeks, she had been forced to wear it 3 times, first for her father's funeral, then her mother's, and now, most heartbreakingly of all, that of her handsome young husband, Arthur. As people reach adulthood, they accept that one day they will bury their parents. They don't like the thought of it, of course, and it hurts them inside when it happens, but they accept it. It is part of life. What they don't accept and don't understand is how they come to be burying a healthy and strong 22-year-old husband after a little more than 1 year of marriage. Death. When they are young and in love, it is not something that they ever consider. They believe that they will live in their state of joy forever. Of course, life is a harsh teacher. At times, it can be cruel and unrelenting. This was one such time. Holly was alone at the graveside as she watched the coffin being lowered into the ground. Arthur's parents were long since dead. She had never met them. Whatever siblings he had were scattered around the world. Great Britain, Ireland, and India, of all places. Again, she had never met them, and only knew them by name and vicariously through Arthur's stories. His employers did not attend the funerals of their workers, and those friends who weren't struck down with sickness themselves were too fearful of public places. She was alone. As the coffin disappeared from view, that realization hit her. She was alone in the world, and there was nothing she could do about it at all. Chapter 2, 2 years later, New York City. Holly James wasn't sure if she felt excitement or fear as she sat down with her coffee cup. She decided it was a mixture of both. She took a sip of her coffee and decided she'd like to add a lump of sugar. But she had no sugar. She couldn't remember the last time she had any in the larder. Sugar was a luxury, and luxuries were firmly off her menu. She pushed the cup to one side and drew the newspaper toward her. She had bought it less than an hour ago. She had seen copies of this particular title on Mr. Jones's newsstand for as long as she could remember. She had never seen a single person purchase a copy. However, they must do so because every month Mr. Jones faithfully restocked the publication when the new edition came out. She had been so nervous when she bought it, half thinking that a wave of sly comments and strange looks were going to come her way. Mr. Jones didn't give the matter a second thought. She could have been purchasing anything as he smiled and wished her a good day. Of course, it wasn't just any title she was purchasing. The newspaper Holly had purchased was the Matrimonial Times. For the 4th week in succession, Holly had found it difficult to pay the rent. It was at this point that she had made her choice. Not that she actually had much of a choice, as there was no way she could physically work more hours. There was no prospect of better paid work, at least by undertaking moral work. The way matters stood, she might have to abandon her home and move into a tenement. But those places were awful, and young women like herself weren't safe living in them. There would always be someone wanting to take advantage. She would do anything rather than move there. Her poor dead husband would certainly not want that to happen, and she wasn't going to let it. The thought of marrying for a second time horrified her, but it had been 2 years since Arthur's death. She knew that he would expect her to get on with life. So many others were lost that terrible winter when influenza ripped through the city. So many others she knew had already remarried, and she hadn't been able to even consider the step until now. But the circumstances she found herself in left her with little choice. It had to be now. Besides, she was only 23. Did she want to live the rest of her life as a widow? No, but until now she had not been ready. She knew that she couldn't continue on her current path. With each passing week, she seemed to eat less and less in order to make the rent money. If she lost any more weight, her looks would fade, and with it the hope of finding a suitable man. She wouldn't be forced into the tenements. She had a plan. She had seen other women in similar positions do it. In fact, she had read an article that said hundreds of East Coast women undertook this solution each year. She was going to head west. She was going to become a mail-order bride. She was going to marry a man she had never met. The only issue was that she hadn't found the man in question yet. That was the reason behind her interest in this copy of the Matrimonial Times. The Matrimonial Times was used by gentlemen out west who placed advertisements when they were ready to marry. The western frontier towns suffered a huge shortage of women, and so this was among their very few options. In years to come, all of that would change, but single men now headed west in search of fortune or to escape their own miserable lives. Occasionally, a man would take his family, but for the most part, the route was left to single men. Her eyes ran quickly over the advertisements. Rancher after rancher, an occasional saloon owner, tailor, undertaker, or doctor. Some were widowers, wanting a mother to replace one taken from their children. Some wanted companionship, while others had only financial reasons for needing a woman by their sides. She would not get anywhere unless she took action, and so she looked at the advertisements before her one last time before taking up her pen and guiding it onto the sheet of crisp writing paper. If she procrastinated any longer, she would be destined never to find her place in the sun. And so she began. Dear Robert, having been attracted by your recent advertisement in the Matrimonial Times newspaper, I now find myself succumbing to the temptation to respond. I can unfortunately relate to your feelings of loss, and you have my sympathy as well as my empathy for the loss of your spouse. My husband Arthur was called by our Lord 2 years ago, and I am left childless and without a suitable means of livelihood. Rest assured that I am quite willing and able to carry my own weight, and do not need to remarry for the purpose of being a kept woman. Although ranch life would be a new experience for me, I am quite eager to attempt the work required by such a lifestyle. Having mourned for long enough, I am ready to start afresh in a new location. Should a new husband and children be the Lord's will, I am ready for the change. You may be interested in my personal attributes. Whether or not you deem it unbecoming to discuss physical beauty, suffice it to say that I have been referred to as fair. I am 23, slight in stature and of average height, with brown shoulder-length hair and green eyes. It would please me to enter into further correspondence to learn more about your intentions and about you as a person. Respectfully yours, Holly James. Her mother had taught her always to double-check her writing, and so she did just that before folding the letter and securing it in an envelope, which she then addressed. Her satisfaction with the venture was complete in all but the final line of the address. She paused as she carefully scribed, Robert Parsons, Whitegate Ranch. No hope could no hope be an indication, a forewarning, or a talisman of sorts. With a final flourish of the pen, she penned the name on the envelope, all the while wondering the reason behind naming the town such. Sampson trotted majestically into No Hope, just as the sun was appearing on the horizon. Robert Parsons, well positioned in the saddle, was relieved that the day was not yet unbearably sun-drenched. Sunrise in the west was always spectacular, but the dreariness of No Hope's Main Street would need significantly more than the rising sun to make it at all appealing. It was, of course, much like every other western settlement around these parts. The constant heat, dust, and dry air caused the paint to quickly flake, and well-maintained facades were not uppermost on any No Hope inhabitants' list of priorities. The little shack-like townhouses drifted by, to be replaced by what passed for commercial structures, distinguished by their well-maintained signage. No Hope remained colorless, and all the signs were painted white and lettered by the same hand. The rider pressed Sampson forward to arrive in the main square, having passed the mercantile, the tailor, the barber, the blacksmith, and lastly, and quite fittingly, the undertaker's. The more prominent buildings dominated a square that did not deserve the grandiose name. Among these was the largest of No Hope's establishments, Miss Tyrone's Saloon, which proudly held its corner position. On the opposite corner, quite appropriately, stood the sheriff's office and the jail. Miss Tyrone's would quite regularly, at least weekly, bid farewell to a shady character, only for him to spend the night under the sheriff's watchful eye in the town's jail cell. 7%. The one and only bank in town enjoyed the implied protection of being a neighbor to the sheriff's office. At least, that was the idea. Beside the bank was the lawyer's office, occupied by the drunkard old Martin. Why No Hope even had a legal office was a mystery to most residents, as very little legal work required attention hereabouts nowadays. The third side of the square hosted both the doctor's and the mayor's homes. Apart from their location, they shared the honor of being the grandest homes in town, despite being far removed from the typical city abode seen back east. The largely underutilized and therefore oversized post office was found next to the mayor's house. Although fears that it might close were well founded, its doors somehow remained open throughout every business day. The remaining side of the square was home to the church. Its setting a little way back from the street seemed to signify its embarrassment at sharing the square with such an establishment as Miss Tyrone's. Among the flaky buildings of No Hope, the pastor kept the church's appearance quite grand. The sunlight only caused it to gleam whiter. The small crosses in the graveyard stood straight and were respectfully cared for, with colorful flowers brightening some, in glaring contrast to the setting in which they stood. Robert Parsons called this home, for all it was worth, and he was under no illusion that he would feel at home anywhere else. He arrived here at the age of 9, following his family after his father had struck it lucky on his gold claim. Being a wise man, Robert's father had invested his takings in cattle ranching and given up prospecting at just the right time. Whitegate Ranch was the result of this wise investment, together with nearly 18 years of blood, sweat, tears, and much hard toiling. Old Mr. Parsons was now at rest beneath one of the little crosses in the graveyard, and it was left to Robert to keep the family business prosperous. Life was tough out west, and during the years that Robert had control of the business, he had faced untold tragedies, disasters, and calamities. It was not easy to come back from the disease that hit the cattle. Over 2 horrendous months, the herd his father had so lovingly built up succumbed as one by one the cattle dropped like flies. The fetid air from the burning corpses of the afflicted animals remained a stark memory even 6 months later. Robert worked undaunted to rebuild the herd, and no sooner had he done so than a freak accident gave rise to the fire that thoroughly razed a section of the ranch house. Thankfully, the blaze claimed no lives. Any man would have thought that the worst possible disaster, but fate had an even worse blow in store. In time, Rose gave birth to Robert's beautiful and perfect son. Husband and wife doted on Edward, named after his late grandpappy. They were the happiest family for the few days they had together, for that was all the time Robert was given with his wife and baby boy before both mother and child were so cruelly taken. The doctor said there was nothing he could do. Baby Edward lay for eternity beside his mother and grandfather in the church graveyard. Robert learned firsthand the sting of death as he mourned and wallowed in his grief. The ranch lost money, as treacherous ranch hands took advantage of Robert's absence, and opportunistic neighbors cashed in on his lack of attention. It was widely recognized throughout No Hope that Whitegate Ranch had deteriorated to a mere shadow of its former majesty. No man can mourn forever, and Robert eventually emerged from his stupor. His sadness was replaced by anger and determination, as he vowed that the life his father had created from the dirt would not fail. It would not fall on his shoulders that his proud father's legacy was destroyed, and he had wasted no time in getting the ball rolling once again on the path toward prosperity. His first mission was to find a wife strong enough to bear him the children he would need to pass the legacy on to. Young, strong women capable of bearing children and fit and responsible enough to handle such a legacy were, however, not to be found in the vicinity of No Hope. Of course, No Hope did have womenfolk, although not many in comparison to the male population. Miss Ellie was the tailor's daughter, but she was only 17 and therefore not eligible. Saloon girls were of course plentiful in any western shantytown or small settlement, and No Hope was no different. Girls of loose morals and dubious character were hardly suitable marriage candidates, though. Robert could see no alternative to advertising for a mail order bride in the hopes of attracting a suitable wife from the East. 2 months after placing his advertisement, Robert had yet to receive a letter in response. He had waited 2 weeks before returning to town, and it was with uncertain hopes of finding a letter that he now made his way to the post office. His hopes had to wait, however, as his first port of call before the post office was to see the bank manager. He had important business there, and it was with that foremost in mind that he tethered Sampson to the hitching post outside the bank. After conducting the most minor attempts at grooming himself, he dusted his pants and entered the bank. After almost an hour, he emerged with a face like thunder. Although he had been granted the required loan, the bank manager had imposed questionably high interest rates and repayment terms. He had to have the money if he had any hopes of keeping the ranch afloat, but this debt would only exacerbate an already almost impossible situation. Robert would see to it that Whitegate Ranch was restored to its former glory and stood strong so that it would never have to face insecurity again. He would then be the person to whom the now pompous businessmen would come for help, and he would be in a position to help them at inflated rates. Robert would have his day in the sun. Of that much he was certain. The letter awaiting him at the post office extinguished all thoughts of retribution and angry feelings. The letter was addressed to him in the most elegant script imaginable outside of a monastery. His advertisement had garnered a reply. Was he the only man to be so thoroughly surprised that this means of securing a wife actually worked? Of course, he had to appreciate that these were early days yet, and it was in this frame of mind that he tore open the envelope to extricate the contents. The respondent might be unsuitable in every way. He weighed the letter thoughtfully in his hand and then slid it into his waistcoat pocket, to be read in private once he was home and out of view of inquisitive eyes. Sampson was more than willing to spirit him home to Whitegate Ranch as fast as possible. It was with a resurgence of hope that he mounted his steed and was carried home to investigate the letter and all it offered. In a town such as this, renewed hope was a rarity. Chapter 3. Holly James could not imagine why such a crowd of people would want to congregate at a train station. She wondered, as she pushed through the throng, how many of them could possibly be boarding any of the trains due at the station. She would be correct in her assumption that most were there simply to marvel at the miracle of the age, a speedy means of transport across the continent. Among those impeding her progress were the poorest of the poor and the wealthiest of the city's society, from desperate pickpockets and ne'er-do-wells to social butterflies eager to see and be seen. She would never have managed to battle through the crush of bodies with her heavy trunk without the help of the carriage driver, who followed behind with it. She had bought the trunk secondhand, doubting that she had enough possessions to carry into her new life to fill it. Once she had started packing, it filled remarkably easily. The extra she had paid the carriage driver, although sorely missed, was definitely well spent. The grieving widow could scarcely fathom that she had only begun her correspondence with Robert Parsons of Whitegate Ranch a mere 6 months before. Here she was, now quite unbelievably, embarking on a journey westward to become his wife. It was with extreme trepidation and a dollop of hope that she had written her first letter to the rancher. She was quite certain that hers would be only one of 100 that Robert Parsons was sure to receive from eligible brides across the East. There was little hope of its being read, let alone responded to. Had she been asked, after dispatching that first letter, what would become of it, she would most certainly have answered, not very much. There was, after all, no reason for hers to stand out among all the others. To say that the letter from Whitegate Ranch in No Hope, which arrived some 6 weeks after hers was sent, was a surprise would be a great understatement. She admitted in her response to his letter that its arrival had caused her heart to leap in her chest. Robert had replied. Just as he had been impressed by the script on her envelope, she was impressed by the elegance of his. The writing on the envelope showed the writer to be educated and not a cowboy ruffian. Her hopes were raised by this indication, since she was not resigned to spending her life with a husband who was unable to pique her interest with his conversation. She thought back, as she stood before the train, to how her fingers had trembled with anticipation while opening that first envelope. Dear Holly, it is with profound thanks that I write to you for replying to my advertisement. I take the liberty of addressing you by your first name, as I am hopeful that this is the start of an intimate and enduring relationship. I am sorry for your loss, and that you are now left without any means of provision. I can relate to your losing your beloved Arthur, as my own grief was so raw for so long. It was never my intention to seek another wife, but time is indeed a healer, and my desire for a family of my own persists. My wife passed only days after birthing a dear son, Edward. If losing her was not heart-wrenching enough, little Edward followed his mother to the arms of the Lord within the hour. Any comfort I might have been afforded lies in them being together for all eternity. Taking cognizance of your address, I must assume that your knowledge of ranch life is non-existent. That is of no consequence, as the home would be your domain, and I would welcome you to run it as you see fit. I was raised on Whitegate Ranch, which my father built up from the dirt into a prosperous business. In all honesty, it has not maintained that prosperity while in my care, having suffered much misfortune and hardship. I will rebuild the business, and of that I have no doubt, but I do need a strong woman by my side in this venture. With the right wife, Whitegate Ranch will be the greatest ranch this area has ever known. Should you desire to continue this correspondence, it is very important to me that you do not labor under any misconceptions or illusions. While Whitegate Ranch is not failing, it does not currently offer a life of luxury. Not for the present moment, anyway. You would likely want to know about me to some extent. I am not to be found in the house much and spend most of my time outdoors where I am happiest. In the evenings, I enjoy relaxing with a book. While I am sure my appearance is of some importance to you, I do not know how best to describe myself, and would prefer not to mislead you in any way. I am 27 years old, neither particularly young nor old. I am not scarred or in any way disfigured. My younger sister Mary lives with me at Whitegate, and her presence delights me every day. You should know that, as long as she wants to live here, this will be her home. Please feel free to ask whatever questions you have. I would be willing to tell you all that you need to know. I just find I cannot think of any more to tell you without prompting. I would like to hear more about you and your likes and wishes. I look forward to receiving your letter. Robert Parsons. The letters became telegrams, which made for speedier delivery, and finally, a marriage proposal. Holly quickly got a sense of the man behind the letters. Robert was a determined character, hardworking and kind, with strong Christian values. She held all these qualities in great esteem, and so when at last he proposed, she did not think twice about accepting. While writing to Robert, Holly's financial position remained perilous. She had given up her job in the laundry for a better position in an upmarket bakery, where it was thought that her looks might promote sales. The best part of working in the bakery was that she was allowed to take home any unsold merchandise when they closed in the evenings. Although she was glad to have the job in the bakery, which allowed her to eat like royalty on some nights, she had no doubt that were it not for the job, she would have ended up living in a tenement. She would not be sorry to give up the job, but she was eternally grateful for having it. Truth be told, after losing her Arthur, she would not be sorry to leave any part of her life here behind. She presented her ticket to the porter and followed him up the platform after he took possession of her trunk. He pointed her toward her car, and she climbed aboard, thanking him as she went. Her heart beat faster as the realization dawned that she was finally on her way. She had high hopes that the journey would be a great adventure. She had a compartment to herself for which she was grateful. No sooner had she accepted this than the door opened and a young woman entered. Holly stood to introduce herself, and the redhead replied with a nod. "Good morning. My name is Rachel." "I am pleased to meet you, Rachel. My name is Holly James. Where are you heading, if I might ask?" "We'll be traveling companions," she said nervously. I'm going to be on board for a while, so it is best we know all about one another. I am traveling to a town out west with a very odd name. And what might that name be? Holly could not help but wonder why she seemed so nervous. Rachel let her guard down slightly and laughed. The town is called No Hope. Chapter 4. Holly and Rachel delighted in one another's company. It was their good fortune that they got along so well with one another, given that the journey was long. They joked about being spared the torture of sharing a cramped space with a pompous know-it-all or a tedious bore. Both women were fun and lively, although Rachel was clearly nervous about the prospect of embarking on her new life. Holly had told Rachel about losing Arthur and her decision to escape the depression of having to visit familiar places without him. "I, too, am a widow," Rachel offered with a smile. "You have probably put the pieces together and realized that I am going to No Hope for the same reason as you. I will be marrying none other than the local sheriff." "The sheriff," Holly echoed in awe, picturing a well-built, handsome man with a glinting badge on his chest, seated on a strong steed. "I just never imagined women from the East marrying anyone other than cowboys out west." Rachel laughed. "You and me both. It stands to reason, though, that if there aren't enough women for the cowboys, the other menfolk in these parts would have the same dilemma. I probably would not even have written to him were he not the sheriff. His being in that position suggests that he is the exact opposite of my late husband." She crossed herself half-heartedly. God rest his soul. Holly was under no illusion that Rachel was grieving her dead husband, and she was curious as to the reasons. "In what way?" Holly asked as the train finally pulled out of the station. Rachel removed her bonnet. "I will be very glad to see the last of this place. I guess we can get comfortable now, Holly." Holly gave her an inquisitive look and did not interrupt her. She was most interested to hear her story. "When I was just 18, I was forced into marriage. I am not yet 20 now, so my brief spell of wedded bliss was not long ago. I was one of 9 children to a widowed mother." Holly suppressed the urge to whistle out loud at that admission. She hardly knew Rachel well enough to do so, and besides, it would have been most unbecoming of a young lady. Instead, she looked at her in stunned admiration. How did she manage with such a large family, all alone? "Not at all well, in fact, which was why I had to be married off. Besides being one less mouth to feed, I am quite certain that John, my late husband, paid my mother to take me off her hands." Holly could hardly believe it. "Your mother sold you to a man? You were not in love with each other then, I assume?" John was almost 40, had lost most of his hair, and was most definitely not starving by any stretch of the imagination. I would not be surprised if he could not fit through this compartment's door. Fat Holly does not begin to describe his size. Holly did not even try to suppress her mirth at Rachel's description, and Rachel smiled back mischievously. She was somewhat relieved that Holly appreciated her sense of humor, and she was also grateful that she was interested in her life story. John was also a crook. Worst of all was that he had his fat fingers in so many pies that one never knew what might happen next with him. When he died, I wanted nothing to do with his blood money, so I donated most of it to the orphanage. Some good should come of all the misery for which he was responsible while he lived, I think. "Bravo, Rachel. Well done. That was very caring of you," Holly applauded sincerely, unsure whether she would have had the courage to do likewise had she found herself in Rachel's position. "I could never have enjoyed the money myself. Knowing where it had come from, it would not have felt right." "I understand. How did he die? You don't have to tell me if you don't want to." Prosody. "He was shot in the back one night," Rachel said matter-of-factly, "by a rival, no less." "You are not sorry?" "I cannot pretend to be sorry, Holly, and I would never lie to you about that. I'm not sorry. Being trapped in a marriage with him for 20 of my best years would have been the end of Rachel, as I know her." Rachel's confession of her lack of feelings for the man and her coldness when speaking of him made Holly feel quite uncomfortable. Rachel noticed the change in Holly's demeanor, and she reached out to touch her knee. "I know that you cannot understand how I could not have feelings for the man I married. You cannot understand that we did not have the love in our marriage that you and Arthur were lucky to have. Not all marriages have the depth of feeling that you two had. Of course, I understand. Our pasts are behind us now. Holly shivered. Tell me about your sheriff, then. It is odd that his name is also John. I trust that this is not a bad omen. Rachel smiled, and Holly did too. He has only been in No Hope for about a year. He says it is quiet there and without any real criminals to worry about. No Hope has only the occasional drunkard needing a night in the cell to sober up. He is a bachelor, attracted to the West by the promise of adventure, although he does not seem to have had much of that. And he is your age? He is a little older than I am. He would have to be the sheriff, I think. 30 isn't 40, so there's that going for him, if you know what I mean. Rachel shifted in her seat. I want to feel safe. I don't think I am expecting all that much. Do you? Holly shook her head. She certainly did not. She knew that she had not felt safe since Arthur's passing, and she completely understood Rachel's wish for security. The trip westward went quickly, and Holly did not even get the opportunity to read the book she had brought with her for the journey. The two shared stories about their pasts and their hopes for the future. They were soon firm friends and were relieved that they would have a familiar face when they started their lives in No Hope. Rachel seemed to be in the lavatory for a very long time on the second morning of their journey. Holly was very concerned, especially given that Rachel had been quite pale earlier that morning. She went to check that all was well and paused outside the lavatory door. Holly heard the unmistakable sound of Rachel retching through the closed door. Rachel was throwing up. Holly listened outside the door, although she knew that she should have left Rachel to her privacy and headed straight back to the compartment. When the door opened, the two women stared at each other in horror before returning to the compartment in silence. Holly now understood Rachel's apprehension at moving out west. You are going to have a baby? Holly asked, taking Rachel's hands in hers. Rachel nodded. Does the sheriff know? Rachel burst into tears, and Holly knew before she even answered that the sheriff did not know. No, he doesn't. Chapter 5. Holly and Rachel delighted in one another's company. It was their good fortune that they got along so well with one another, given that the journey was long. They joked about being spared the torture of sharing a cramped space with a pompous know-it-all or a tedious bore. Both women were fun and lively, although Rachel was clearly nervous about the prospect of embarking on her new life. Holly had told Rachel about losing Arthur and her decision to escape the depression of having to visit familiar places without him. I, too, am a widow, Rachel offered with a smile. You have probably put the pieces together and realized that I am going to No Hope for the same reason as you. I will be marrying none other than the local sheriff. The sheriff, Holly echoed in awe, picturing a well-built, handsome man with a glinting badge on his chest, seated on a strong steed. I just never imagined women from the East marrying anyone other than cowboys out west. Rachel laughed. You and me both. It stands to reason, though, that if there aren't enough women for the cowboys, the other menfolk in these parts would have the same dilemma. I probably would not even have written to him were he not the sheriff. His being in that position suggests that he is the exact opposite of my late husband. She crossed herself half-heartedly. God rest his soul. Holly was under no illusion that Rachel was grieving her dead husband, and she was curious as to the reasons. In what way? Holly asked as the train finally pulled out of the station. Rachel removed her bonnet. I will be very glad to see the last of this place. I guess we can get comfortable now, Holly. Holly gave her an inquisitive look and did not interrupt her. She was most interested to hear her story. When I was just 18, I was forced into marriage. I am not yet 20 now, so my brief spell of wedded bliss was not long ago. I was one of 9 children to a widowed mother. Holly suppressed the urge to whistle out loud at that admission. She hardly knew Rachel well enough to do so, and besides, it would have been most unbecoming of a young lady. Instead, she looked at her in stunned admiration. How did she manage with such a large family, all alone? Not at all well, in fact, which was why I had to be married off. Besides being one less mouth to feed, I am quite certain that John, my late husband, paid my mother to take me off her hands. Holly could hardly believe it. Your mother sold you to a man? You were not in love with each other then, I assume? John was almost 40, had lost most of his hair, and was most definitely not starving by any stretch of the imagination. I would not be surprised if he could not fit through this compartment's door. Fat, Holly, does not begin to describe his size. Holly did not even try to suppress her mirth at Rachel's description, and Rachel smiled back mischievously. She was somewhat relieved that Holly appreciated her sense of humor, and she was also grateful that she was interested in her life story. John was also a crook. Worst of all was that he had his fat fingers in so many pies that one never knew what might happen next with him. When he died, I wanted nothing to do with his blood money, so I donated most of it to the orphanage. Some good should come of all the misery for which he was responsible while he lived, I think. Bravo, Rachel. Well done. That was very caring of you, Holly applauded sincerely, unsure whether she would have had the courage to do likewise had she found herself in Rachel's position. I could never have enjoyed the money myself, knowing where it had come from. It would not have felt right. I understand. How did he die? You don't have to tell me if you don't want to. He was shot in the back one night, Rachel said matter-of-factly, by a rival, no less. You are not sorry? I cannot pretend to be sorry, Holly, and I would never lie to you about that. I'm not sorry. Being trapped in a marriage with him for 20 of my best years would have been the end of Rachel as I know her. Rachel's confession of her lack of feelings for the man and her coldness when speaking of him made Holly feel quite uncomfortable. Rachel noticed the change in Holly's demeanor, and she reached out to touch her knee. I know that you cannot understand how I could not have feelings for the man I married. You cannot understand that we did not have the love in our marriage that you and Arthur were lucky to have. Not all marriages have the depth of feeling that you two had. Of course I understand. Our pasts are behind us now. Holly shivered. Tell me about your sheriff, then. It is odd that his name is also John. I trust that this is not a bad omen. Rachel smiled, and Holly did too. He has only been in No Hope for about a year. He says it is quiet there and without any real criminals to worry about. No Hope has only the occasional drunkard needing a night in the cell to sober up. He is a bachelor, attracted to the West by the promise of adventure, although he does not seem to have had much of that. And he is your age? He is a little older than I am. He would have to be the sheriff, I think. 30 isn't 40, so there's that going for him, if you know what I mean. Rachel shifted in her seat. I want to feel safe. I don't think I am expecting all that much. Do you? Holly shook her head. She certainly did not. She knew that she had not felt safe since Arthur's passing, and she completely understood Rachel's wish for security. The trip westward went quickly, and Holly did not even get the opportunity to read the book she had brought with her for the journey. The two shared stories about their pasts and their hopes for the future. They were soon firm friends and were relieved that they would have a familiar face when they started their lives in No Hope. Rachel seemed to be in the lavatory for a very long time on the second morning of their journey. Holly was very concerned, especially given that Rachel had been quite pale earlier that morning. She went to check that all was well and paused outside the lavatory door. Holly heard the unmistakable sound of Rachel retching through the closed door. Rachel was throwing up. Holly listened outside the door, although she knew that she should have left Rachel to her privacy and headed straight back to the compartment. When the door opened, the two women stared at each other in horror before returning to the compartment in silence. Holly now understood Rachel's apprehension at moving out west. You are going to have a baby? Holly asked, taking Rachel's hands in hers. Rachel nodded. Does the sheriff know? Rachel burst into tears, and Holly knew before she even answered that the sheriff did not know. No, he doesn't. Chapter 6. Sam Coates proved to be an enchanting man. Holly and Rachel seemed to sit transfixed as he switched from story to story about his past. He was an Irishman who had trained to be a doctor in no less an institution than Trinity College itself. He spoke of the streets of Dublin and the people he knew there. Holly noticed the scarcity of tales relating to drinking, but she knew that Irishmen liked to drink. Back home, They were renowned for it. And then I decided enough was enough, and I bought my passage to New York. Best thing I ever did, declared Sam in the dreamy accent that both women could listen to for hours. It sounds terrible, agreed Rachel, appalled at the stories about British rule in Ireland. That it was, young Rachel. Sam nodded, twirling his bushy mustache with his finger. But New York wasn't a place for the faint-hearted either. I had all sorts of people brought to me for treatment, victims of the gangs or members of the gangs themselves. He paused for a second, and Holly thought there might be more to that particular part of Sam's story, but she decided that she wasn't going to push him on it. He was a fine storyteller, and his presence would help speed up these final hours of the journey. Anyway, I decided that cold winters weren't for me. I have experienced enough of those back home. I thought, Sam Coates, why don't you head for a place where the sun always shines? And so I decided to head west. I have been traveling from place to place for the past 4 years now. So, what takes you to No Hope, Dr. Coates? Asked Holly. I might ask you and Miss Rachel the same, Miss James. We are to be wed, replied Rachel, before Holly could answer. Sam's arrival had meant that the two women had yet to conclude their conversation about Rachel's situation. She strongly doubted that Holly would say anything in front of a man, but stranger things had happened in her life. I am to be married to Sheriff John Lucas, Holly smiled. I am marrying Mr. Robert Parsons. He is a rancher. My goodness, you are marrying these men without even meeting them first? Sam asked, looking somewhat shocked. Indeed, we are what you might call mail-order brides. Surely being out west for a number of years, you must have heard of them? Replied Holly, feeling a little confused and slightly insulted. It was as though Sam Coates was suggesting that they were stupid or worse for settling on their course of action. Of course, Miss James. It is just that I confess I have never had a conversation with anyone who has made that decision in life. And now here I am in a railroad car with two of you. I have to say, I think you are rather brave. How so, Dr. Coates? Asked Rachel, pleased at the compliment. Here you are, traveling hundreds, no thousands of miles from your homes to a place you have never visited, to marry someone that you have never even met. That takes great courage. You might also say that the men we are marrying are brave. After all, they don't know what they are getting, replied Holly. As soon as she had said the words, she could have bitten her tongue off. Rachel gave her a look that showed a mixture of anger and hurt. It sounded to Rachel like an intentional slight against her, which was not Holly's intention at all. Sam Coates hadn't noticed, of course, being unaware of their earlier conversation. What I mean to say is, normally a man likes to see a woman before he marries her, to see if she is to his liking. Liking? Teased Sam in response. Holly went a deep shade of red. She had managed to dig herself a hole with Rachel, and in her attempt to dig herself out of it, landed herself in one just as big with the doctor. Rachel's hurt was gone. She understood from Holly's last comment that she had meant no offense, and so stepped in to help her out. That is very true, Holly, she agreed. For all these men know, we might be frightful creatures, with only the option of becoming mail-order brides to secure ourselves a man. So why are you becoming mail-order brides? Inquired Sam. If you don't mind me saying so, you are both fine-looking women. I am sure there is no shortage of young men back in the city who would wish to court you. Now it was Rachel's turn to turn red. Compliments from handsome doctors were not what she was used to. We are both widows, Dr. Coates, said Holly, genuinely looking forlorn as her thoughts turned to Arthur. It makes sense for us to both start again somewhere new, without the ever-present ghosts of the past, so to speak. Sam nodded wisely. Now that I can understand, Miss James, I hope you don't consider me rude or disrespectful for asking. Not at all, Dr. Coates. Now, if we might return to my earlier question, what brings you to No Hope? I like to move about, ladies. We Irish folks never like being in a place for too long. I had news 2 weeks ago that the old doc in No Hope had passed on, bless his soul, and so I am filling that void. Sam hung his head for a moment in silent tribute to the old doctor of No Hope, but Holly suspected that the handsome Dr. Coates was not telling them the full story. Still, it was no business of hers. She looked out the window and watched the dusty, dry landscape roll by. What would await them all in no hope? Chapter 7. Holly woke as the first rays of sunlight lit their compartment. They had been up late into the night, enjoying supper together in the dining car, talking about anything and everything. Finally, weariness overcame them, and Sam left the women to retire to his own compartment for the night. She stretched and knew one thing for certain. After being cramped up in this compartment on the train for so long, she would be glad of a night's sleep in a real bed. Then the anxiety hit the pit of her stomach. She suddenly realized that today was the day she would finally meet Robert, the man she would marry. What would he be like? Would he be handsome? Would he care for her? Would he approve of her appearance? What of his sister? How would she react to a new woman in the home? What of the town? She suddenly realized that the good Dr. Coates was right. She had been foolish to enter into this arrangement without even meeting the man. Then she looked over at Rachel, who was just stirring, and realized that she was fortunate in many ways. Given that there was a woman on the ranch, there was no need for her and Robert to marry straight away. She would have her own room in the ranch house until they had grown more accustomed to each other. Rachel, however, would be marrying that very day, as she and the sheriff would be the only two living in their home. Rachel could not possibly stay under his roof while they were not married. It would be neither right nor proper. She also had the problem of deciding whether to tell him about her situation. Whichever way she turned, her issue was truly complicated. Rachel was awake, and she smiled at Holly. "The day is here, then," she whispered. "Indeed, it is," Holly whispered back. "How do you feel? Have you decided what you're going to do?" Rachel looked crestfallen as she leaned forward and dropped her voice further. "I haven't decided yet. I want to be truthful, and yet I confess I fear rejection. What would I do in a strange town with no money and the sheriff as an enemy? I will wait and see what kind of man the sheriff appears to be." With that, she jumped up. The morning sickness had hit. By the time she had returned, Sam Coates had called in on them and was standing in the doorway of their compartment, talking to Holly about ranching. Holly was trying to look interested, but in truth, talk of cattle and horses was a little dull. Without warning, the brakes were suddenly applied to the train. Once again, a nervous flutter hit the pit of Holly's stomach. This was it. They had arrived. No hope was in sight. She drew out a small hand mirror and checked her appearance. She made a few adjustments here and there and decided that good enough was good enough. She passed it over to Rachel, who had turned very pale. She raised her eyebrows as if to inquire if she was feeling all right, and she got a small smile and a nod of the head as a response. As the train slowed further, Holly wished Rachel well and said that she would look her up on her first visit to the town. Rachel said that would be delightful. They said their goodbyes to Sam Coates, who thanked them for their delightful company and was kind enough to say that he would stay with them until they were collected from the station. The women both insisted they would be fine, but thanked him for his thoughtfulness. Sam was the first to disembark from the train and helped the two women down to the patch of dirt that seemed to pass for No Hope's platform. He made his excuses and left them with a small bow. The women were sad to see him go, but glad that they already knew the local doctor. The first to hit Holly was the heat. Although she had sensed the heat rising the farther west they traveled, this was her first time outside the train. The time was not yet 9 o'clock, and she already found it almost unbearable. She would have to make some urgent alterations to her dresses if she was to be comfortable. The second to hit Holly was that they now seemed to be surrounded by nothing. She could see a collection of small buildings in the distance that must be the town, but the railway station consisted of nothing more than hard compacted dirt and a small wooden shelter that had already seen better days. Welcome home, she thought. Finally, she saw those waiting for the passengers who had just alighted from the train, all 4 of them. 2 immediately went further up the platform and greeted 2 men. That left 2. One was very tall with dark hair. He was certainly handsome, and the flash of sunlight on the badge pinned to his broad chest told her that he was Rachel's husband-to-be, the sheriff. He was just the way Holly had imagined when Rachel had mentioned the word sheriff. He had a beautiful white smile that somehow told her that he was a kind and understanding man. She turned to Rachel and gave her a reassuring smile. "There he is, Rachel." She leaned in and gave her new friend a squeeze. "You'll be fine. He looks very handsome." "I hope so." "Holly," she replied, and walked forward to meet the man she believed was Sheriff John Lucas. Holly's attention turned to the man standing a little way back, in the shadow of the wooden hut, reducing him to a silhouette. She walked forward, trying her best to ignore the greeting going on between Rachel and the sheriff. Finally, she reached the shadow and waited for her eyes to adjust to the light. "Miss James?" the man who was just coming into focus asked. "Holly James?" When her eyes finally fixed themselves on the figure in the shadows, one thing became immediately clear. Robert Parsons was undeniably handsome. Chapter 8. Holly sat perfectly upright next to Robert Parsons, who was now driving the cart. She had learned that the horse was named Samson. He was Robert's favorite among the 10 he owned. She had learned that Robert was very strong. She guessed it must have been as a result of the years of working on the ranch. He managed to lift her trunk onto the cart as though it was weightless. She had learned that Robert was a gentleman. He assisted her onto the cart and didn't laugh as she almost fell flat on her face in the attempt. Instead, he showed off his strength for a second time by lifting her up. He clamped his hands around her waist and lifted her as though she were just a doll. She felt a shudder of excitement ripple through her body as he did so, followed immediately by feelings of guilt. She felt as if she had betrayed Arthur, but she tried to shake that feeling. The fact she was here meant that she had already accepted that Arthur wouldn't mind. However, she hadn't learned much else. The conversation was somewhat stilted. He had managed to ask after her journey, but other than that, he didn't offer much. She assumed that he found it difficult to talk to women. After all, there didn't seem to be that many around the town. Everywhere she looked, she saw men going about their daily business, with only a handful of women and children among them. "The church looks delightful, Robert," she said as they rode through the main square. "Does it?" he replied. "I suppose the pastor keeps it nice enough." She caught a glimpse of the sheriff's office as they drove through, and she wondered about the sort of home Rachel would be living in. By tonight, Rachel would be married in that very church. Hopefully, she would be married, depending on how the sheriff reacted to Rachel's confession. That is, if she told him at all. She was glad that all she had to worry about was some difficult conversation. The town of No Hope looked pleasant enough, although the amenities seemed somewhat lacking in comparison to those in the city. Besides the church and the sheriff's office, there was the bank, the post office, the saloon, the mercantile, and the premises of the undertaker, the tailor, the barber, the blacksmith, the farrier, the lawyer, and the doctor. Nothing more and nothing less than the standard frontier town. The town's houses seemed to be in good order and were whitewashed in a vain attempt to keep them cool. "It is a strange name for such a lovely little town, No Hope." "Who named it?" she inquired. "No idea," replied Robert as though he had never given the name of the town a moment's consideration. Holly began to wonder if Robert was displeased with her appearance or if she had managed to cause offense in some way. She began to worry. Maybe Robert would end up sending her back? Should she ask him? They had passed through the town and were heading out the other side into what appeared to be a wild, barren wasteland. They rode past a lone tree, so unlike the ones in the parks of the city, and Robert suddenly spoke in a proud voice. "You are now on Whitegate Ranch land." All Holly could see was miles of nothingness. It looked nothing like she had imagined a ranch might look. But she picked up on Robert's pride for his ranch and wondered if this might be a route into his mind and a way to get him to talk. "Tell me about the ranch, Robert. I'm so excited to see it all." This much was true. Having never owned land, she had no idea what it would be like to own seemingly endless tracts of it. Robert immediately launched into an animated monologue about cattle types, barns, feeding schedules, beef prices, horses, ranch hands, fencing, rustlers, and 100 other things that she didn't understand. However, she did enjoy listening to Robert's gentle voice and the obvious passion he had for his ranch and his work. "Tell me about Mary," Holly asked when it was clear that the talk about the ranch was over. She figured that matters concerning the ranch would principally be Robert's domain, and whatever she had to understand, she could pick up over time. Mary was Robert's younger sister. In his very first letter, he had told Holly that Mary would have a home at the ranch as long as it suited her. Since that first letter, she had picked up little additional detail. It seemed strange that a young woman could not find a husband and no hope. After all, many of the men were clearly bringing women in from the outside. Something was strange, but she couldn't put her finger on it. It will be great fun to have a sister. Holly wasn't actually sure that it would be great fun at all. How would Mary react to her presence? She had always remembered what her mother once said, how having two women in the kitchen was always a bad idea. Would Mary think that she was coming to usurp her place? Of course, her fears might be completely unjustified, but she did think it a little odd that Mary didn't offer any correspondence herself over the 6 months, not even a few paragraphs by way of an introduction and welcome. Robert seemed to clam up when it came to any discussion of his sister. "I always let Mary speak for herself," was his non-committal reply, which only served to raise even more doubts in her mind. They rode in silence for a few more minutes, with Holly becoming increasingly anxious along the way. On the horizon, Holly began to make out shapes of buildings. She strained her eyes to try to see, and she leaned forward in the cart. But she would just have to be patient and wait for the cart to draw closer. Before long, the buildings had grown, and Robert was pointing out the impressive barns and the ranch hands' quarters. He explained that the quarters for the ranch hands were far too big for the 3 men he currently employed, and that many of the staff had been laid off during the hard times. But he was hopeful that as the business grew once again, more staff would be needed, and he had the quarters ready for them when the time came. They were close enough now to be able to see hundreds of small dots scattered across the plain that she immediately presumed were cattle. But one thing drew her eye like no other. It was the Whitegate Ranch house itself. From a distance, it looked impressive. However, as they drove closer, it became clear that the black building, the only one that wasn't a gleaming white and which Holly had assumed was in the shadows, was actually the rotten corpse of the burnt-out wing that Robert had once described in a letter. The part of the ranch house that was habitable looked homely enough, though. It was painted white, like all the other buildings she had seen since her arrival, and the little porch held a scattering of rockers. But Holly couldn't stop looking at the charred remains of the wing. How terrible it must have been for Robert to see the building that his father had constructed reduced to ashes. One day it would be restored, Holly thought. She would do her utmost to ensure that. A young man emerged from a storehouse and waved. He came over and took hold of Sampson's harness. "Howdy, Mr. Parsons," he said, then nodded in Holly's direction. Miss James, this is David, one of our ranch hands," Robert said by way of introduction. David was 18, but looked no older than 16. He seemed transfixed by Holly, which she found strangely off-putting. She reminded herself that the young man didn't see many women, and he certainly wouldn't have been taught manners. He would therefore not know better than to stare. "A pleasure to meet you, David," replied Holly with a smile. "Anything to report?" inquired Robert of the boy. "No, sir, as quiet as a mouse all night." "Good. At least that is something." Holly wondered what this exchange was about. It sounded slightly sinister, as though Robert had expected something untoward to have occurred while he had been away the previous day. One of the small pieces of information she had managed to pry from him was that he'd had business in the town and had decided to stay overnight in a cheap room in the saloon to save himself the unnecessary journey back and forth. Nothing happened, he assured Holly, who hadn't asked. She was unaware of the reputation of Western saloons, and so his comment was completely lost on her. Her thoughts were interrupted by a shout from the porch. "Finally, I thought you would simply never get here," a beautiful young girl shouted. She ran toward Holly with a look of utter joy and delight. "Mary, Be careful, warned Robert, seemingly very concerned about his younger sister running down the stairs in her excitement. Mary ignored her brother completely and threw herself at Holly, embracing her. Holly felt an arm go over her shoulder and draw her in as tightly as she was able. It was a strange one-armed embrace, but it could hardly have been otherwise, because the very first thing Holly noticed about Mary was that she only had one arm. Chapter 9. Rachel sat in the cart and tried her best to conceal her bitter disappointment. The man who had met Rachel at the train station, the handsome man with the shiny badge on his firm, muscular chest, wasn't Sheriff John. He was the sheriff's deputy, Luke. Luke explained how Sheriff John was otherwise engaged in important business and, as such, was unable to collect his new bride from the train station. Rachel wondered what on earth the sheriff could be up to that would prevent him from meeting his new wife on her arrival. It seemed most unchivalrous. However, the man was the sheriff, and she supposed that the business of law enforcement didn't always fall at the most convenient time. She hadn't given it much consideration, but she supposed that her life was going to be full of missed dinners and disturbed nights. Luke seemed to be a fascinating character as well as incredibly handsome. He said he was around 26 years of age. He wasn't sure exactly because he was raised in an orphanage in a rough area of Philadelphia, where no one seemed to have any idea of his age on arrival. He vaguely recalled the day, standing in front of the matron's desk, and being told in no uncertain terms that his failure to obey the rules would land him in the very bowels of hell. He was then taken away, stripped naked, and dusted for lice. He could still feel the unforgiving burn of the powder even now. What he couldn't recall, however, were details of his parents and how he ended up in the orphanage in the first place. The next 14 years passed very much in the same manner as the very first day, harsh and unforgiving. The nuns who came in to teach the orphans were surely the most unchristian people he had ever met. Punishment followed, reprisal followed beating. The essential element that was missing from the orphanage was love. Luke headed west at the first available opportunity and ended up in the town of No Hope. It seemed very appropriate, as time after time, the nuns had told him that there was no hope for him and that he was destined for jail or worse. After jobbing his way around town, he finally found his way to the deputy's position when no one else seemed to want to take it up. He enjoyed the work, and he declared that keeping the town free of criminals was absolutely essential. Rachel dared to ask what Sheriff John was like, but Luke kept staring straight ahead and said noncommittally, "He's the sheriff." What on earth did that mean, Rachel wondered. He's the sheriff. She knew that. She had asked what kind of man he was, not what position he held. A sense of dread and foreboding overcame her. Deputy Luke halted the cart outside the sheriff's office. "I've been instructed to put you in the office to wait for John's return," he said warmly. Luke walked around the rear of the cart and very gently lifted Rachel to the ground. As he held her close to him, that feeling of disappointment hit her once again. She would have been delighted to arrive in the town and find that her new husband was a man like Luke. She could only hope that Sheriff John was similar in nature. However, her hopes were shattered some 15 minutes later when Sheriff John arrived at the office. He was not a rugged young 26-year-old with a gleam in his eye. Sheriff John was a fat, balding man in his late 30s or early 40s. It seemed that he had lied about his age in his letters, and that made Rachel wonder what else he might have lied about. It was then that she realized that she had hardly been truthful herself, so she couldn't criticize too severely. The huge stain on his shirt looked suspiciously like the remnants of egg, and it was immediately obvious why he needed a wife if he regularly presented himself in such a manner. Sheriff John did not fit the picture of the handsome sheriff that Rachel had in her mind. Still, she knew she needed to be grateful. After all, she had significant problems back home, and this was her only way out. "Well, Rachel, I'm absolutely delighted to meet you," Sheriff John said, holding out his hand for a brusque handshake, which seemed a very odd way to greet the woman he was just about to marry. "I've arranged for the pastor to be at the church shortly, so if you are ready, we will go and do the deed, as it were," he said in a strange voice with a little laugh. Quite frankly, Rachel was far from ready. For a moment, she toyed with telling him about the unborn baby growing in her belly, but then immediately decided against it. She could tell in an instant that Sheriff John was not a man who was likely to be understanding. If she told him and he rejected her, what did the future hold for her? She hoped that, if that happened, she could waltz off into the sunset with Deputy Luke, but she had been in his company for barely half an hour. She knew nothing about him either. She hadn't even asked if he was married. No, there was only one option. She would have to accompany the sheriff to the church to be married. As they walked outside toward the church, the sheriff talked endlessly about himself, not asking a single question about Rachel or her journey. What a very rude, arrogant man, she thought. The church looked absolutely delightful. On any other day, at any other wedding, Rachel would have been thrilled to have attended such a place. However, on this day, Rachel could do nothing but hold back the tears. She stood in front of the pastor and repeated the vows, witnessed by Deputy Luke and the pastor's sister. In a trice, it was all over. Within 2 hours of arriving in the town of No Hope, Rachel was married to a man she found disturbing, rude, and most unattractive. This was not the way it was meant to be. The sheriff walked her back to his office, then entered through a little door into his small but surprisingly comfortable home to the rear. He quickly gave her a tour of the sitting room, the bedroom, and the kitchen. "This is our bedroom here," the sheriff said with a wicked glint in his eye as he pointed to the room. Rachel felt sick to her stomach. "I'll have somebody bring your trunk up in a moment and you can unpack, but don't move anything of mine. I have urgent business in town," he declared importantly. "There's a terrible gang of cattle rustlers going around, creating havoc for the ranchers. I must be seen to be doing something." He continued with a raised eyebrow as though Rachel would completely and utterly understand. Not wanting to appear stupid by asking what cattle rustlers were, Rachel nodded wisely. "I'll be back around 6, the sheriff announced. "You may prepare dinner for that time. The kitchen is stocked sufficiently for this evening. Tomorrow I will show you around town and, most importantly, point you in the direction of the mercantile store." Rachel was stunned. They had been married less than half an hour ago, and now she was on her own in a new house without her husband, with a list of orders to fulfill. Why didn't the man set aside some time to attempt to get to know his new bride? Or was it simply because he wasn't bothered, and what he really wanted was a housekeeper? She did her very best with the meal. When John returned, he devoured it hungrily, without a single word offered in thanks or appreciation. Rachel made an attempt at conversation, but he declared that he was very tired. Instead of engaging in enchanting small talk, he dozed off in front of the small fireplace. After a few hours, he woke up with a loud snore and declared that it was time for bed. A cold shiver went down her spine. Rachel walked into the bedroom with trepidation. She couldn't imagine what it would be like to sleep with this man. However, she need not have worried. The moment John placed his head on the pillow, he was asleep. He had no intention of interacting further with his new wife. Silently, she changed into her long nightdress and crept in carefully beside him, taking the utmost care not to wake him. She put her own head on the hard pillow and silently cried herself to sleep. Chapter 10. Holly James dabbed her eyes as she listened to Mary's absolutely heart-wrenching story. Within 10 minutes of arriving, Holly felt like she had known Mary for a lifetime. Robert had left Holly in the care of his sister while he rushed out to deal with urgent ranch business. Holly supposed that this was the way it would always be. The ranch would always take priority over their lives. The cattle would need to be fed, and there would be 100 other tasks that would need doing on a daily basis. She hoped that one day they might be able to employ more ranch hands to take some of the workload off Robert's shoulders. Robert had left Mary to give Holly a tour of the house. He did, at least, have the good grace to apologize for leaving so soon after she had arrived. Holly accepted the apology without thought and said that they would talk later. The house was surprisingly larger than it appeared from the outside. She supposed that in the days when the burnt-out wing was in use, It might have been considered a mansion. It immediately struck her as she walked around with Mary that the home gave a sense of having been intended for children. One day, she vowed, the burnt wing would be rebuilt, and she would raise a whole army of young children within these walls. Of course, before that could happen, she would have to have the occasional proper conversation with Robert. She had only been here a matter of hours, and conversation would no doubt follow in due course. He, like she, was probably still finding his feet. She was delighted to see that, as promised, she had her own room. She thought that she might have misinterpreted Robert's letter, and that she might have to share with Mary until the wedding. Having her own space in which to settle would greatly help for the time being. After all, she had been living alone and had become accustomed to there being no one else in the bedroom at night. She was a light sleeper, and the presence of someone else might have proved to be a disturbance. Just looking at the bed with its crisp white sheets made Holly feel tired. She hadn't had a proper night's sleep in days. The train compartment was hardly designed for rest and relaxation. However, she resisted the urge to suggest that she take a short nap. The last thing she wanted Mary to think was that she was rude, or worse still, lazy. Besides that, Holly was keen to bond with the woman who would be sharing her home. After the tour, Holly made herself comfortable in the sitting room while Mary went to make tea. However, Holly felt exceedingly guilty for allowing a woman with just one arm to be waiting on her, so she went into the kitchen and offered to help with the preparations. Mary would hear nothing of it. "Guests? Having to make tea? What sort of hostess do you think I am?" Then she froze in horror and went a distinct shade of scarlet. She realized that Holly would soon be the mistress of Whitegate Ranch. No, that came out wrong. You aren't a guest. This is your home now. Please accept my apologies. I just feel that, on your first day here, I must wait on you. It is how things should be." Holly brushed aside the apologies, telling her that they weren't needed, and uttered a few uncomfortable words of thanks. But she still refused to sit down, and marveled at Mary's dexterity in the kitchen, flicking the iron kettle on and off the stove and preparing a teapot and cups with complete ease using her one hand. Although she could manage most things, Mary admitted that she had been unable to master the skill of writing with her remaining hand, which had caused her great frustration. She had been left-handed until the terrible incident, and try as she might, she couldn't get the right hand to hold the pen in a manner that would allow her to produce more than a few words that were at all legible. Hatter. She could handle the ranch accounts, though. Listing numbers in columns and doing addition were simple, and this was a burden she had been able to take off Robert. Holly nodded her head as though she knew all about the frustration of adjusting to life with one arm. It certainly answered her question about why Mary had never written to her during her correspondence with Robert. She was just itching to find out more about Mary. She could just tell that she had a story to tell. A few minutes later, they were in the sitting room, drinking piping hot tea like two aristocratic ladies in a stately English home. Finally, after some meaningless chit-chat, Holly ventured to ask Mary about the accident to which she had alluded in the kitchen. "Didn't Robert tell you in his letters?" she inquired. Holly shook her head. "No, I knew nothing until my arrival. In fact, he said very little about you, other than that you would always have a home here." Mary nodded her head as though she completely understood her brother's position. "I would think many women would not like to move into a new home where another woman was already in control of matters," said Mary. "However, I can see that you are completely different. It will be a pleasure to share the work around the house with you. It will be such fun. We'll be just like real sisters. So tell me about the incident." Holly pressed the girl with a smile. "If we are to be sisters, I need to know everything about you." Mary nodded. She had not told the tale in a long time. In fact, the last time had been to another mail-order bride who had arrived at Whitegate Ranch. She had been Robert's first wife who died of childbed fever. Mary took a deep breath and began her story. "It happened when we were just children." Mary explained that when they were young, they'd been playing down at the creek, the only bit of water that actually ran through Whitegate Ranch land. Robert had climbed on top of the pile of rocks that overlooked the creek and was pretending to be an Indian attacking Mary while she made her way across the frontier in a wagon. As he stood on top of the pile of rocks, they became loose under his feet and started a landslide. Mary became trapped under a pile of large boulders. Robert managed to lift every rock off her except one giant boulder that he just couldn't move. This rock was trapping her arm, pinning her to the ground. Mary lay in a daze, bruised and in considerable pain. Robert was left with two options: to remain with his sister in the hope that they would be found, or to ride back to the ranch and get help, which would leave her exposed to the elements and vulnerable to wild creatures. The heat and cold could kill even a healthy man, let alone a weak and injured child, and the coyotes and wolves could smell death in the air. It was an agonizing choice. Wisely, he chose the second option, knowing that if he remained with his sister, they might never be found. He left their water caddy pressed into Mary's good hand and placed his hunting knife at her side, not knowing whether she would even be able to use it if needed. With a small tear, he promised he would be back and ran off in the direction of their horses. Mary was left alone, watching the vultures circle and listening to the calls of the coyotes in the rocky hills for almost 3 hours, until finally, as the sun was beginning to set, Robert returned with her father and 30 ranch hands. Bit by bit, they managed to pry the huge boulder from the ground to free her trapped arm. Once she was released, the grimace on her father's face told Mary everything she needed to know about the severity of her injury. He lifted Mary and slung her over the back of his horse and charged off toward town to see the doctor who confirmed her father's worst fears. Their prosody 7%. There was absolutely nothing the doctor could do to save the arm, so he simply gave Mary a few shots of brandy and amputated the lifeless, useless limb. Mary explained to Holly how she had felt no pain during the procedure. However, if she closed her eyes, she could still hear the sound of the saw working its way through the bone of her little arm. "Robert has been carrying the burden of what happened to me ever since," said Mary remorsefully. "I never blamed him." Mary lowered her voice and sat forward in her chair, causing Holly to mimic her actions. "Although Father never forgave him, not even as he lay on his deathbed, I think that actually hurt me more than it did Robert." Holly could barely imagine the horror and anguish that Robert must have lived with his entire life. She remembered when she had accidentally burned her mother's hand when she was a child and had been consumed with guilt for weeks, even though the wound healed very quickly. Mary's presence and her disability were omnipresent and obvious reminders of what had happened. Mary lowered her voice further still. "I regret to say it, but my brother is no stranger to tragedy. Father died a little over 3 years ago," Mary began, as she made herself comfortable in her chair. Holly could tell that she had been starved of regular female company, and she relished being able to tell her story. "It was a simple seizure, we believe. Robert found him dead in the barn one morning. His body was still warm. It was such a shame that they never really repaired their relationship after my accident. It would have given Robert so much comfort." Just the previous day, Robert's first wife, Rose, who I know he's told you about in his letters, announced that she was pregnant. It had been such a happy time on the ranch. I know my father was pleased that another generation was being born into the family to secure the ranch for another 60 years. And then suddenly, all that joy was wiped out in one fell swoop. Of course, that was just the beginning of everything. Father's death started a string of awful events that Robert thought were being sent to punish him. When we returned after my father's funeral, we found the first of the cattle dead on the ground. Within a matter of weeks, some strange, unidentified disease had ripped through the majority of the herd. All Robert could do was burn the carcasses in some vain hope of trying to stop the disease from spreading. But it did no good. We lost most of the stock, and for a ranch, that is nothing short of an absolute disaster. Without stock, we can't breed, we can't grow the herd, and we have nothing to sell at the end of the day. Trying to buy replacement animals after the disease had run its course used most of the savings that my father had left. Competing ranches traditionally show little mercy to those who are struggling. They inflate the prices of their good breeding stock, knowing perfectly well that there is little choice but to pay. Holly shook her head, thinking it an incredibly unchristian attitude. It seemed strange, considering that at any time that same ranch might experience something similar. Would it not be better if everyone treated one another charitably? She kept her thoughts to herself. She didn't understand the ranch business in the slightest. It was possible that Mary would think her stupid and naive for thinking in such terms. Robert worked night and day for 4 straight months, Mary continued. He was nothing short of an exhausted wreck before Rose finally told him that he had to slow down, otherwise he might not live to see his child born. He spent 2 full days in bed, waking only to eat soup. On that second day, the blaze hit the west wing. Robert woke to the smell of foul, rancid smoke in his nostrils. In his weakness and confusion, he wasn't sure what was happening, but fortunately, he had the foresight to climb out of his bed. When the fog lifted from his mind, he saw that the west wing was completely ablaze around him. He summoned the ranch hands, but not even 30 men could get sufficient water from the well to douse the flames in time. "How did it start?" demanded Holly, transfixed by the story. "We have no idea," said Mary, "but I have my suspicions." Holly looked at Mary inquisitively and thought that very little probably got past her. "I suspect a pair of older ranch hands, brothers who disappeared about a month after the blaze. I believe they were disgruntled for some reason. It is possible that father may have promised them something in his will that simply didn't transpire. If I had to say what I believe happened, I think that they started the fire in the hopes of killing us all and taking over the ranch," Mary said, as though she had given the matter considerable thought. A shiver went down Holly's spine. "That is just awful." Mary looked at Holly and gave a little reassuring smile. "Don't worry, this isn't normal. The worst we have to put up with is cattle rustlers these days. They are just interested in stealing the cattle, and they have never hurt anyone." Mary paused for a moment, remembering where she had got to in her story. "Robert saw it as a sign from God that he'd been displeased with what my brother saw as his slothful behavior. Although, as I argued with him, 2 days of resting could hardly be considered idleness. But of course, he would hear nothing of it. He redoubled his efforts in an attempt to get the ranch back on track. Unfortunately, he neglected poor Rose's needs during that time. Rose was tormented by this feeling of being abandoned. She had me, of course, but it wasn't enough. She needed the love and support of her husband. I tried to tell him, but of course he was like a man possessed, determined to get the ranch back on track. He seemed to be driven by this desire to make it bigger and better than when father prospered. Then, of course, the worst tragedy of all hit. Mary's voice cracked with emotion as she thought about it. Rose's time came and the labor was long and painful. The midwife, if you can actually call her that out here, was here just short of 3 days. Finally, a weak, tired Rose gave birth to a beautiful little baby boy. Little Edward. He was such a picture of joy. You could see Robert's nose and eyes on that little face, just like his father in miniature. Robert was transfixed. He knew from that moment that work was not the most important thing in his life. Mary smiled, just recalling the face of her nephew, and then a single tear appeared on her cheek. My brother's joy was to be short-lived. Over the next few days, however, childbed fever racked Rose, and there was absolutely nothing the doctor could do to save her. Then, less than 1 hour after Rose had departed this world, I went to the crib and picked up little baby Edward, only to find him dead. She shook her head in disbelief. Robert's wife and son had been wiped out within 1 hour. He was shattered and racked with guilt like never before. The doctor assured him that there was absolutely nothing he could have done to save his wife and child, but that didn't stop the torment. It took him 2 long years to reach the point where he had the courage to write to you and to ask you to be his wife. Mary reached forward and grasped Holly's hand. "My brother is a good man, but it will take him a little time to get used to you. Do not think he is cold, shallow, or distant. I just know that he is still racked by the guilt of what he sees as his abandonment of his wife in favor of his work. He loved her deeply, just as I know you loved your Arthur deeply. But I also know this: he will come to adore you. I'm sure you will adore him too when you get to know him, and you will both be very happy." Mary offered a warm smile and a nod of her head. Holly was sure it was true. The correspondence with Robert had been warm and sincere. Robert was a handsome man with whom it would be easy for any woman to fall in love. She just prayed that she was pleasing to him. She knew how difficult it could be for a man to give his heart to another. "I just know that deep in my heart," Mary continued, oblivious to the thoughts going on in Holly's mind. "But please give Robert some time. Yes, he's often difficult to talk to, especially with people he doesn't know well, but that will come with time. It does not mean that he doesn't like you. At least you have me. I will help you around the ranch and the house. We can divide tasks and take some of the burden off Robert. Do you agree?" "Of course," said Holly, once again wiping a tear from her cheek. Robert's story brought home thoughts of losing her beloved Arthur. She, too, was racked with guilt that she was here, about to marry another man. She hoped that one day she could grow to love this handsome rancher. But she knew that it wouldn't be instant, and that it was best for both of them. One day, they too could be blissfully happy at Whitegate Ranch. She would have an army of children running around that she had forever promised herself. She and Robert would teach them to ride horses. She would teach her daughters to cook and how to care for a husband in the future. With Mary at their side, she and Robert would lead a blissful life. She had imagined it all. But she knew that it would take time. It was entirely understandable. She would be patient, and good would come of it in the end. She spent the rest of the afternoon with Mary, before preparing the evening meal. Robert had invited the 3 ranch hands to dine with them, to introduce them to the woman who was to become the new mistress of the ranch. Holly would probably have preferred to have spent some time alone with her husband-to-be. However, she understood the idea behind Robert extending the invitation to his staff. Poor David. The young boy couldn't stop staring at Holly. She refused to be offended and simply found it amusing. The poor boy needed to find himself a woman, and sooner rather than later. She wondered who may be available for him in town, if anyone at all. Besides David, there was Jasper, a red-haired Scotsman who had made his way out to America some 20 years ago. However, he had retained his full Scottish accent, and at times Holly could not understand a word he was saying, so she simply nodded her head in agreement at the appropriate times. Finally, there was Eli, the oldest and the longest-serving of the 3 ranchmen. He must have been 50 years old if he was a day, and through the years of working outside in the heat and sun, his face had developed a dark brown, leathery complexion. It was obvious from the conversation around the table that Eli was Robert's right-hand man. The others, even Robert at times, deferred to Eli's wisdom. After the meal, Holly and Mary began to clear up, and the ranch hands gave their thanks and made their way back to their quarters. Robert poured himself a small glass of brandy and sat by the fire. He assured Holly that he wasn't much of a drinker, but most evenings he liked a small brandy as a nightcap to unwind. At this point, Holly was exhausted and felt that she could have slept standing up. She made her excuses and made her way to bed. Holly woke when the first rays of sunshine warmed her bedroom. She'd had a long, deep sleep. Now she felt refreshed to start her first full day at Whitegate Ranch. Now, as those first rays of sunlight hit the room, she was fully awake and excited to start her day. She quickly got herself dressed and crept out into the corridor. She could hear Mary's soft breathing from her room. She knew that her future sister-in-law was still fast asleep. She made her way to the kitchen and found the iron kettle still warm. She guessed that Robert probably rose even before dawn. There would be much to do on a ranch in the morning. She made herself coffee and walked out onto the porch. The sunrise was a glorious sight, as the top of the sun was just emerging from behind the Rocky Mountains, casting a deep red glow over everything. She assumed that the mysterious creek in which Robert and Mary had played as children, where Mary suffered her tragic accident, must lie in the shadow of the mountain, and she hoped that very soon Robert would take her to explore the ranch lands. It seemed wondrous that just one family could own so much land. Back home in the city, people were fortunate to have as many as 2 rooms to live in. "It is a wonderful sight, is it not?" came a deep male voice from the corner of the porch. Holly jumped in shock and turned to see Robert sitting in a rocker. She had been so transfixed with the sunrise that she'd failed to see him sitting so nearby. "I often enjoy sitting here, drinking my coffee. I never grow tired of such a spectacular view." "No, I can understand that completely," replied Holly, smiling. "May I join you?" she asked. "Of course," said Robert, rising slightly by way of a chivalrous gesture as Holly sat. "How did you sleep on your first night here on the ranch?" "Well," replied Holly, "but there was something strange." "What was that?" inquired Robert. "The silence. I'm so used to noise all around me. Despite being so terribly tired, it took me a while to drift off." Prosody. "I couldn't place what the problem was until now. The silence is so strange to me." "I will always treasure the silence," said Robert. "Occasionally, when I have to go away on business to buy or sell stock, I stay in one of the larger towns. The noise always strikes me. I love the silence and tranquility of Whitegate. There is no place on earth like it in my mind." Holly completely agreed with his assessment. There had certainly been nothing in her world that compared to the wonders of Whitegate Ranch. Chapter 11. It was now 3 weeks since her arrival at the town of No Hope, but there was still no talk of marriage at Whitegate Ranch. Over those 3 weeks, she had mastered her horse riding skills and ventured out with Robert all over the vast estate of Whitegate Ranch. At times, she was unsteady on her mount, since she was still adjusting to the new skill. However, with each passing day, she became increasingly proficient on her beautiful gray mare. Robert had opened up about his past even more. He had told her the same story that she'd already heard from Mary: the discovery of his father's body, the burning down of the West Wing, and the death of his wife and son. She listened again as though it were the first time she'd heard of the terrible tragedy. Once again, she burst into tears, hearing the emotion in his voice when he described the death of his wife and only child. In return, Holly had shared her past experiences: her marriage destroyed by death, her lonely childhood, and then the despair and feeling of absolute desperation as she struggled to make ends meet in the city as a widow. It was as though they were 2 peas in a pod, each with their own tragic tale that needed a happy ending. After all this close bonding, there had still been no talk of setting a wedding date. She wondered if Robert had gone completely off the idea and was just glad that Holly was here to assist his sister with the housework and the duties around the ranch. Over the 3 weeks, the women divided the tasks among them. Holly had taken on most of the household chores, which freed Mary to take on more of the administration of the ranch business. However, Mary was still feeling frustrated. She couldn't write as well as she would like. One afternoon, while Holly was waiting for the scones to bake, she came out of the kitchen to find Mary struggling to write in the ledger. She stood quietly and watched her for a while before she determined what the problem was. Mary was holding the pen incorrectly. Holly ventured over and offered a few words of support. "Maybe if you just hold the pen in this manner, it might be a little easier for you," she said. Mary tried it and agreed that it was easier to write that way. For almost 2 weeks, they had sat together for an hour each afternoon, and Holly had helped Mary learn to write again. With just minor adjustments of the hand and the angle at which she held the pen, Holly helped her gain confidence. Mary copied text from the Bible. Slowly, strength and control were built in a hand that previously was unable to write. Mary was amazed by how much progress she had made in such a short time. Although she felt as though she could talk to Robert about most matters, she felt uncomfortable about bringing up the subject of the marriage. Instead, she approached the subject with Mary. "Sister, I have a burning question, and I'm somewhat scared to ask Robert." "What is it?" asked Mary, full of concern. "I have been here for a little over 3 weeks now, and there has been no talk of marriage yet. There is no date fixed. The young woman with whom I traveled on the train got married on the very morning that she arrived." "Really?" asked Mary, somewhat confused. "That seems very hasty." "I agree that was a little soon. I would have been very uncomfortable with that arrangement," replied Holly. But it was a case of necessity. She was marrying the sheriff, you see. Without another woman in the house, it would have been improper for her to stay there unmarried. Mary nodded her head in understanding. I'm not sure what kind of timescale Robert had in mind for the marriage. He wanted to make sure you were absolutely comfortable with the idea before he would even consider it. Holly looked back blankly, not really understanding. In percent. She had traveled for thousands of miles to be his bride. If she wasn't comfortable with the idea, she would never have left the East. Let me tell you another story, Mary said in an attempt to explain. You know Rose was also a mail-order bride? Holly nodded her head. She was fully aware of this and the similarities between herself and Robert's previous wife. However, what you probably don't know is that Robert didn't instigate the correspondence with her. Holly was a little confused. I don't understand, she said miserably. Our mother was actually writing to Rose, pretending to be Robert. She wanted to ensure Robert's future. He would never find a bride out here. There was simply no one appropriate in town, and she knew that if she left the matter to Robert or our father, he would never marry and never produce an heir to inherit the ranch. You see, our mother knew that she was dying, and this was her final attempt at helping her son. So let me get this right, Holly said. Your mother wrote to Rose pretending to be Robert and simply arranged the marriage without his knowledge? Absolutely right, said Mary with a smile. Mother was a very forthright person. Rose just appeared at the gates of the ranch one day. Her final letter seemed to have been lost in the mail, so Mother didn't know when she would be arriving. There was a lot of explaining to do that day. Father agreed that this was the best step to get Robert married. Therefore, the day after Rose's arrival, and despite Robert's very vocal protests, they were carried to the church in Father's carriage and married. But the impression I got from Robert was that he was very deeply in love with his first wife, said Holly. Oh, he was, agreed Mary. However, that wasn't the case at first. That love grew over time after the marriage had taken place. Robert wants things to be different this time. I'm pretty sure that he wants the love between you to grow first and then for the marriage to take place. I think in that way it will be most special. Don't you agree? Holly thought about her own previous marriage, which was born of love. She remembered the joy of standing in front of the altar and being married to Arthur. She couldn't quite imagine being hurried into the church to marry a man she'd just met and knew absolutely nothing about, as had happened to Rachel. There would be no joy in that service whatsoever. She agreed with Mary that Robert's approach was probably best. However, she wasn't sure how long it would be until the wedding. She wasn't sure if she should feel relief, shock, or alarm. She wasn't sure if she should feel anything at all. What was normal for a woman in her position? Other than Rachel, she had never met anyone in her position, and so it was impossible to judge what was normal. With Rachel on her mind, she saw a route to change the course of the conversation. She started talking about the woman she had met on the train. She explained some of her story, taking care to leave out the more scandalous aspects. Mary was enthralled and decided that they really should check on Rachel. Why don't we ask Robert if we can venture into town tomorrow? He will have to drive, so it will depend on what needs doing on the ranch. What a marvelous idea, Holly said. Robert had started teaching her how to drive the cart, but she was far from proficient and she wouldn't be comfortable driving alone into town with Mary. It will be delightful to see Rachel. I hope she's doing well with the sheriff. Mary gave her a look that suggested that poor Rachel would be doing far from well. Chapter 12. Ah, Mary Parsons, what on earth can I do for you? Sheriff John Lucas said, putting down the bowl of chili he had been noisily slurping. Hello to you, Sheriff, replied Mary with a smile. We're actually here to see your wife. Holly was a little stunned that Mary was addressing this man as the sheriff. Just like Rachel, this wasn't the picture of the young, handsome law enforcer that she had in mind when the word sheriff was uttered. Poor Rachel, thought Holly immediately. No wonder Mary pulled the strange face when Holly explained that Rachel had come out west to marry him. Holly wondered how Rachel would be faring. She wanted nothing more than a younger man to help care for and protect her. However, It seemed that the sheriff had been less than honest in his correspondence. Had she spoken to him about her situation? "And who might this be?" inquired the sheriff, looking Holly up and down in a most inappropriate manner. Holly mustered her courage and managed to give him a smile despite her skin crawling. "My name is Holly James. I'm here to marry Robert. We will be wed shortly. Your new wife Rachel may have spoken of me. We traveled down to No Hope together on the train." The sheriff shook his head. "No, Rachel doesn't talk much," he insisted. Well, that was odd, thought Holly. On the journey, Rachel didn't stop talking. Maybe it was simply who she was talking to that was the problem. "May we go through, Sheriff?" inquired Mary sweetly, seemingly knowing the best way to handle him. "Of course, miss," the sheriff replied with at least some attempt at being civil. "Do you know the way, or do you want me to show you?" "We will be just fine on our own," Mary insisted. "A pleasure to have met you," Holly lied, taking the cue from Mary about the best way to handle the sheriff. "Oh, no, miss. The pleasure was all mine, I assure you," he said with a little grin. Holly shivered in revulsion and pressed on after Mary. They pushed through a narrow corridor. "Good day, Luke," shouted Mary to a handsome young man seated behind a little desk. He, too, had a gleaming badge on his chest. "This is Holly. She is soon to be my sister-in-law." "A pleasure to meet you, miss," said Luke, standing to offer a small bow. "I believe I saw you when you alighted from the train with young Rachel." He paused for a second. The new Mrs. Lucas, I mean. "I am the deputy, Luke. I hope you have taken to Whitegate Ranch." "Indeed, I have," she smiled back. Now, this was the sort of man she had in mind when Rachel described a sheriff. She was sure that her traveling companion would have been most disappointed that this wasn't the man to whom she would be married, especially as Luke had met her at the station when she first arrived. It must have been a crushing blow to meet the real sheriff after Luke. "We'd better get on," said Mary. "Robert hasn't got a lot of time in town." Luke nodded his head wisely. "Anything I can do, ladies, please let me know." Holly vowed to remember that promise in the future. They moved farther into the building, finally arriving inside the sheriff's own private rooms. They found Rachel in the kitchen, baking. She turned and saw Holly and practically knocked her over in her rush to embrace her. She held her tight, refusing to let go. Finally, when they broke the embrace, Holly and Mary found Rachel in a flood of tears. "Whatever is wrong?" Holly asked, sitting her carefully down on one of the old rockers. "Oh, nothing, nothing," insisted Rachel. "It's just me being silly. I'm just so pleased to see you, that's all." She dried her eyes on her apron and looked over at Mary. "And who's this?" "This is Mary. She is going to be my sister-in-law when Robert and I finally marry." "Pleased to meet you, Mary," replied Rachel with a warm smile. She turned her attention back to Holly. "So the service hasn't taken place yet?" "No, not yet. It still lies ahead," insisted Holly, unsure whether she was speaking the truth. "When it does happen, you and the sheriff will surely get an invitation." The mention of the sheriff knocked the smile immediately from Rachel's face. "Well, that would be wonderful," she said in a less than convincing manner, and she promptly burst into tears once again. "I think you need a nice cup of coffee," declared Mary. "I'll go and make it. Do you take sugar?" Rachel shook her head in response and dabbed at her eyes once again. As Mary pottered off into the kitchen, Holly leaned forward and whispered into Rachel's ear. "Just so you know, I haven't told Mary a single thing about your problems. Have you told the sheriff?" Rachel shook her head. "No, I dared not. You must have heard what sort of man he is." "It was obvious when I mentioned the sheriff that Mary wasn't too impressed," agreed Holly. Mary walked back into the sitting room, having made Rachel a cup of coffee. "Here, drink that. It will make you feel better." "Thank you," replied Rachel. "You are very kind. Holly is very lucky to have a confidant and friend like you. I'm here all alone." She promptly burst into fresh tears. Holly and Mary looked at each other with equal concern. What on earth was going on here? Was it simply the fact that Rachel wasn't impressed with the man she had married, or was there something more sinister going on that they weren't yet aware of? It was as though Rachel could read their minds. "Don't worry, he's not beating me or anything like that. In fact, he's done nothing to me at all. If you know what I mean, at night, he is either out, drunk, or tired." She promptly turned red, embarrassed about discussing such intimate matters with two strangers. "Well, these things take time," said Mary, nodding her head as though she was an experienced married woman and knew it all. Holly understood the real consequences for Rachel of this particular revelation. Every day that passed, the baby would grow larger, and the harder it would be for Rachel to pass the child off as the sheriff's if that was to be her final intention. It seems that he wants nothing more than a housemaid, somebody to cook, clean the house, and wash his clothes. He certainly needed that when I arrived. I doubt they had been washed in years. He offers me no conversation, no care, and hasn't asked a single thing about me. I have absolutely no idea why I'm here. He could have just employed a maid. Some men are like that. They simply wouldn't want to pay for a maid, said Holly, thinking back to the occupants in the tenements neighboring her back east. Some men have no concern about love or the need for a real wife. They simply want somebody to look after them the way mothers do. I can't live like this, Rachel said. This isn't the life I was expecting. Then what on earth will you do? Asked Holly, full of concern. Rachel shook her head. I have absolutely no idea. Run away? There must be someone who would have me, somewhere. I'm not that unattractive, am I? Her hands fell to her belly, and her eyes glanced downward. At that point, Mary suddenly understood that all wasn't as it seemed. Oh my, she declared. Are you with child? Rachel nodded her head and looked up the corridor in a mild panic, hoping that the sheriff wasn't within earshot. And Sheriff John doesn't know? Mary asked, seeking confirmation. Rachel again shook her head. This does somewhat complicate your situation, I have to agree. Desperate, what are your plans? I have absolutely no idea, declared Rachel, before bursting into tears once again. Chapter 13. As they were being driven back to Whitegate Ranch, both Holly and Mary felt extremely guilty about having to leave Rachel in her current situation. Rachel was still distressed and talking about running away, but they had to meet Robert in order to return to the ranch. There was a significant amount of work for him to do on his return, and Holly was only too aware that Robert had rearranged his business in town for that day so that he could drive them. It would be rude and disrespectful to keep the man waiting after he had been so accommodating. They left a tearful Rachel, assuring her that they would see her on Sunday. Once a month, the inhabitants of Whitegate Ranch, the family and the ranch hands, all went into town to attend church because they lived so far out. Mary would have liked to have attended more often. However, the needs of the ranch had to come first. Mary wondered whether, if Holly managed to improve her cart driving skills in the near future, she and her future sister-in-law might be able to attend church on Sundays more regularly. After all, if Holly could drive, Robert need not attend. He could stay at home and attend to the business on the ranch. Mary stored the idea in her mind as a point to raise later over dinner. She thought Holly might be keen on the proposal because she would then be able to see Rachel on a more regular basis. Mary would be able to mingle with the community in which she'd grown up, as she often felt isolated on the ranch. Neither woman said much on the ride back home, thinking about Rachel and her unfortunate situation. Neither had a solution to her particular problem, and neither would have wanted to have been married to the sheriff under any circumstances. The whole situation was a mess. As they approached the ranch, they saw a figure running toward them with arms waving in the air. Robert immediately knew that there was trouble. The two women looked at each other nervously, easily picking up on Robert's tension. As they drew closer, they recognized the person as David. Sir, he shouted. We've had rustlers. Robert muttered under his breath and drove the cart forward quicker. What, boy? Where? Tell me? He demanded as he got closer. David leaped up on the cart effortlessly, even though Robert had increased speed. Eli believes there are about 15 head of cattle gone. They came in on the north side. Must have been very late last night. I thought maybe they had escaped in the night, or we had miscounted, but we found horse tracks outside the barn. Eli says it is definitely rustlers. Robert shook his head in disgust. Some of the neighboring ranches had gone through rustling problems this year. Fortunately, up until this point, Whitegate Ranch had been left untouched. Now it seemed They had joined the list of victims. Instead of going toward the house, Robert turned the cart sharply and made his way up to the north barn, where Eli was patrolling with a shotgun under his arm and a holstered pistol, as though he expected the rustlers to return at any moment to round up the rest of the herd. "How many missing?" demanded Robert, repeating the question he had already asked David, as he brought the cart to a halt and leaped off. 15 or 16, it seems," said Eli, obviously upset by the loss. "I can't believe it. We just haven't had these problems here." "Well, we've got them now," said Robert. "We need to do something about it. We can't afford such a loss." "I'm fully aware of that, sir. I'm very angry at myself." "It's not your fault, Eli," Mary offered calmly. Robert looked at Mary and nodded his head. "You have to sleep, man. We can't be on guard 24 hours a day. We simply don't have enough staff for that. You aren't to blame." Tap. Holly knew the theft of the animals would be a blow to the business, but she didn't quite understand how the animals could be stolen apparently so easily and so silently. After all, it wasn't as though they were kittens. Cattle were very large and very noisy. "What do they do with them, Mary?" she asked in a quiet voice, not wanting to appear stupid in front of Robert and Eli. "They sell them to unscrupulous ranchers," Mary replied, her contempt for such owners very clear in her tone. "But they're all branded with Whitegate's mark," said Holly. "Surely the real owners of rustled cattle are easy to find? You just look at the brand?" "Yes, but with so many ranchers out here, what is someone to do? Turn up at every single ranch and demand to see every single head of livestock. Some of the real big ranches have well over 2,000 animals. Even the most honest sheriff in the world isn't going to be able to do that." She paused for a second and then added a flippant comment. "And there aren't many honest sheriffs in the world." Holly tilted her head at Mary and gave her a questioning look. She thought immediately back to the horrible Sheriff Lucas in town. Was she saying that their sheriff was dishonest? She knew now wasn't the time to ask the question, but at some point, once this rustling business had been resolved, she would raise the question. Robert knew that 15 head of cattle going missing was a blow, but it was hardly the final nail in the coffin of Whitegate Ranch. "I think we need to be on guard for a while," he said. "Maybe this was a little test, a small raid to check whether we had enough people on watch. Maybe they were looking at the layout of the barns. I think we need to split the watch between us for a week and stay up all night to make sure they don't come back. If they come back and wipe out the herd in the north barn, we really will be on our knees," said a concerned Robert. Eli nodded his head. "I'll do the first watch tonight, sir." "No, you won't," declared Robert. "I'll do it myself. You get some rest. There'll be many more nights to come. We just need to be ready in case they come back. I'll go back to the ranch to rest now, and I'll be back over here before 10 this evening. It will take a miracle for anyone to get past me tonight." "Shouldn't we be reporting this theft to the sheriff?" asked Holly. Mary gave a small smile into which Holly read 1,000 possibilities. Robert nodded his head. "We will, but we are back in town on Sunday for church. It will wait until then. Nothing that the sheriff can do now." Mary followed her brother's comment with a small utterance of disgust. Robert ignored it, and Holly felt uncomfortable. Something was clearly afoot between the two of them that centered on the sheriff. When she was alone with Mary, she would be sure to find out. Anything that involved the sheriff also involved Rachel, and she didn't need any further problems. Chapter 14. Holly tossed and turned restlessly that night. Try as she might, she simply couldn't get to sleep. Fearful thoughts were running around her head like a whirlwind hell-bent on destruction. When they were alone preparing dinner that evening, Holly questioned Mary on her strange reaction to the talk of reporting the cattle rustling to the sheriff. Mary explained that it was her firm belief that Sheriff John Lucas was completely and utterly dishonest, making any report of the matter pointless. A cold shiver went down Holly's spine. She asked why Mary hadn't told her this when she'd first mentioned that Rachel had married him, or even earlier that day when they had been in the man's sitting room. There was little point, she said. Let's face it, the poor girl had already married the man. What could be done to change it? There was no reason to cause you alarm or have you tell her unnecessarily without all the facts. Over time, she will probably come to realize the type of man he is of her own accord. That will be better for everyone. No one can be accused of making trouble that way, can they? What makes you think the sheriff is dishonest? Holly asked quietly, as though Sheriff Lucas himself was outside the window, listening to the two women gossip about him. When I am in town, I hear stories. Many stories, actually. I socialize with a handful of the womenfolk, and they know everything that goes on in No Hope. Nothing escapes their watchful glare, I can assure you. If the sheriff was firmer and more proactive, there would be a lot less crime around these parts. Why isn't he? We put our heads together, and we can only come up with one answer. He is taking money on the side and allowing these matters to slip. I didn't think we were particularly blighted with crime here, said Holly, full of concern. She was suddenly seeing robbers, bandits, and confidence tricksters on every corner of the town. It isn't as bad as some towns, admittedly, agreed Mary, but there are plenty of small crimes that go unreported behind the scenes. This is simply because folks know that the sheriff will never get to the bottom of it, so they just don't bother and take matters into their own hands on occasion. What's Robert's view on all of this? Robert is far too trusting, Mary said, pulling a face. He thinks that a man in office should be respected no matter what. That seems to be an honorable viewpoint, suggested Holly. That's true. However, if your sheriff is nothing more than a crook, it becomes very hard to respect the man, replied Mary as she chopped carrots with remarkable speed with just her one arm. Young Deputy Luke would make a far better sheriff, in my opinion. She paused for a second as she moved the next carrot into the correct position. Of course, Robert thinks I am biased because of Luke's handsome looks, she laughed. Are you saying that you think the sheriff is actually behind all of this rustling? Asked Holly. Mary shook her head. No, I strongly doubt that. You've seen the man. He's lazy. He's probably just accepting money from mysterious men that he can't even name. In return, he simply looks the other way, or his investigations end up fruitless. I doubt he has the brains to be the mastermind behind anything. Holly had been wrestling with the implications of these revelations all night. Poor Rachel. Not only was her sheriff neither tall nor handsome, nor as young as she had hoped, but Mary believed he was a crook just like Rachel's first husband. It was as though Rachel was playing out her first marriage for a second time. What with rustlers, Rachel, and an indefinite marriage date, Holly had a lot to think about. Holly lay in bed and looked out of her window at the stars dancing in the sky. The moon was almost full that evening. The moon and stars seemed so brilliant out here in the wilderness. With the vast dark sky stretching for what seemed to be an eternity, it was an amazing sight. She thought of poor Robert, alone, patrolling the northern barn. She thought he might be hungry and decided since she couldn't sleep, she would make him a bite to eat to keep him going until morning. She dressed quickly in her thickest dress, knowing that it would be very cold outside, which had been unexpected at first. She knew perfectly well that the days would be burning hot, but she simply wasn't expecting the night temperatures to drop so quickly or so low. She had been forced to ask for another blanket for her bed on her third night as she was so cold. She went to the kitchen and quickly gathered bread, cheese, pickled onions, and a sliver of cold ham left over from breakfast. She wrapped everything up in a little basket and began walking out toward the north barn. She decided that she wouldn't ride Cherry at this time of night. Despite the moonlight, there were still significant shadows and quite a few rocks on the way. The last thing she would want to do was to fall and hurt herself and add to the problems the ranch faced. Besides, she had a basket of food to hold as well. She had never ridden one-handed before and knew perfectly well that now wasn't the best time to start. It took a good 20 minutes to reach the northern barn on foot. She walked quickly to stave off the worst of the cold. Of course, now that she was here, she had to find Robert in the darkness. The height of the barn blocked out most of the light from the moon. She didn't want to shout out because it would probably end up causing a commotion which in turn would upset the cattle, so she placed her basket carefully on the floor at the barn door and began to seek out Robert, whom she hoped wouldn't be that hard to find. She knew he must be close by to be at hand in case the rustlers returned. Out of nowhere, a heavy hand clamped across her face and covered her mouth. She screamed, but her assailant's hand muffled her cry. The rustlers have got me, she thought. How stupid and impetuous of me to come out on my own. Nobody even knows that I am here. I'll be kidnapped, taken away, and goodness only knows what will happen to me. Mary and Robert will think I've run away in the night. Then a familiar voice boomed out. Holly, is that you? What on earth are you doing out here at this time of night? Her assailant was none other than Robert, who removed his hand from her mouth. Holly's heart slowed as the panic left her body. She turned and instinctively held him close, allowing his strong arms to engulf her and make her feel safe. As Holly's heart slowed, Robert's quickened. It had been a long time since he had held a woman. Robert, you scared me, she breathed into his ear. I couldn't sleep. I thought you could be lonely and hungry. I've brought you food. There's a basket I left by the barn door. What a lovely gesture, whispered Robert, genuinely touched. He held the embrace, not wanting to let go. Shall we eat? Said Holly, finally breaking the silence. Robert reluctantly released her. Sure. It's hungry work watching out for rustlers, you know. They made their way back to the barn door where Holly found her basket and began unpacking the food. Wait a minute, said Robert, opening the barn and easing inside. I'll be back in a second. He emerged with his arms full of animal furs, which he laid out on the ground. We may as well be comfortable while we eat. Holly smiled with contentment and sat on the warm softness of the fur, and Robert laid another over her knees. Doppel. You'll be feeling the chill out here in a moment. Holly pulled the fur in closer, enjoying the warmth that it generated. Thank you, she whispered. They shared the food, and while they ate, Robert pointed out the North Star and the Great Bear in the sky. He explained that if you were lost in the wild, you could actually find your way by the stars. Holly didn't understand a word, but enjoyed listening to Robert's comfortingly deep voice. Isn't this wonderful? She said, then hurriedly added, if, of course, we weren't watching out for cattle rustlers. Robert laughed. I have to say, in many ways, I am rather thankful for the cattle rustlers. If they hadn't come, we wouldn't be here doing this. He looked at Holly with his dark brown eyes, and she felt her stomach flip with excitement. Then, very slowly, he leaned forward and gave her lips the softest of kisses. Holly almost stopped breathing. His kiss was almost intoxicating. As he moved his head back, she longed for him to kiss her again. I've been wanting to do that since the moment you arrived, whispered Robert softly. I hope you don't mind. Not at all, Holly said, reaching out for his hand. I'm so glad you did. With no talk of a wedding date, I rather thought that you might have been disappointed. Disappointed? Robert exclaimed. Nothing could be further from the truth. I'm sorry I made you feel that way. You should have said something. Holly smiled. It wasn't my place. You know the story of my first wife. If I am honest, I felt a little guilty about my feelings for you. Do you understand what I mean? I do, agreed Holly. I've felt the same on occasion, so don't worry. But I also know that my Arthur would want me to be happy. I'm sure that your Rose would have felt the same. Robert was silent for a moment, as though he were considering what Rose might have thought. He gave Holly's hand a little squeeze. I'm sure you are right. I am. There is so much sadness in the world, said Holly, thinking of Rachel trapped in a marriage to a man she didn't and could probably never love. I don't want to add myself to that sadness. Robert kept quiet as though he was thinking. Just when Holly thought he might have silently drifted off to sleep, a soft voice spoke. We are at church on Sunday. Shall we stay after the service and visit the pastor to see what dates he might be free? It took Holly a few seconds to understand what Robert was saying. Is that a marriage proposal, Mr. Parsons? She said with a giggle. He squeezed her hand. Well, technically, you've already accepted because you are already here. But yes, consider it a second marriage proposal, if you will. Robert suddenly felt nauseous. What if she said no? What if he had completely misinterpreted tonight and Holly was still getting used to the idea of the ranch, the town, and him? He didn't want to rush her. He was about to add a caveat that if it were too soon, they could wait, when he felt Holly squeeze his hand in return. I think that would be delightful, she muttered happily. Chapter 15. The drive into No Hope was pleasant that Sunday morning. The sun had not yet risen high in the sky, and so it was pleasantly warm, as opposed to the normal scorching heat. With the threat from the rustlers still real, Robert and Eli had decided that the ranch hands would stay at home that day. It wouldn't take a lot of effort for the rustlers to find out which Sunday of the month everyone at Whitegate Ranch went to church, leaving the place unguarded. They thought it best to be safe rather than sorry. However, by the time the service started, it was already unbearably hot in the small church. It seemed to Holly that the growing town of No Hope would soon need a bigger church to accommodate everyone. As the church filled, she kept looking around nervously, searching for Rachel in the crowd. She was fearful that she had gone through with her threat to run away. Then finally, just as the church was full, she entered on the sheriff's arm. She had clearly performed wonders with the sheriff's appearance since Holly had met him. Gone were the stains down the shirt, and he presented himself in a perfectly crisp white shirt. His sheriff's badge gleamed as the light hit it through the windows. She thought that the man might even have managed to run a comb over what was left of his hair. Rachel was wearing the same dress in which she had traveled, and it looked tired. Clearly, despite the improvements to the sheriff's appearance, he had not found the means to provide his new wife with a new dress. Holly couldn't help but glance down at Rachel's waist and fancied she could see the first thickening there. Maybe her mind was playing tricks, knowing perfectly well that Rachel was with child. However, it wouldn't be long before the other women of the town noticed. Women noticed these things. The sheriff led Rachel to a seat on the very front row, to sit beside a couple who Robert had told her were the mayor and mayoress. Clearly, his position as sheriff earned him some privileges at community gatherings such as this. The pastor was a cheerful-looking man in his early 60s, with a long white beard that boasted more hair than was on his head. He was pleasantly plump, a result of the constant invitations from the No Hope residents for meals, which the pastor obviously always accepted, and during which the housewives made a great show of providing a hearty spread. The pastor did not complain. He considered it a perk of the job. Holly wished she had a hand fan like the one held by the mayor's wife. Now that the chapel was full, it was like a stove inside. As the pastor spoke the words of the service, Holly became distracted by Rachel. She could see her rocking slowly from side to side. Mary glanced across at Holly. She had noticed it too. Holly knew what was going to happen before it did. As Rachel passed out and teetered over, Holly was rushing up the aisle toward her, but she wasn't quick enough to stop her landing in a heap on the church floor. Holly's first thought was for the baby, but she kept her wits enough to keep that thought to herself. Within a moment, Holly was on her knees, holding her friend's head, trying to revive her. Immediately, poor Rachel was surrounded by people, either keen to help or nosy. Sheriff John Lucas had hardly rushed to his new wife's aid. In fact, Holly heard him say, "How embarrassing," to the mayor. "Make way, please," a familiar Irish voice said above the hum of excited chatter. "Excuse me, coming through." Sam Coates pushed his way through the crowd and knelt next to Holly. "Miss James," he said respectfully with a nod of his head. "If I may, who is this?" Holly heard Robert ask Mary from behind her. Holly turned and looked up at Robert. "This is Dr. Coates, with whom Rachel and I undertook part of our train journey here." Proserpinette. She was glad to be in a position to provide Robert with information about the residents of the town that he didn't know. "Miss James, could you loosen some of Rachel's buttons, please?" Sam said, bringing Holly's attention back to the matter at hand. She did as she was told. Sam pulled a bottle of what seemed to be smelling salts from within his waistcoat and waved them under Rachel's nose. After a few moments, Rachel's eyes slowly opened. "So hot?" she managed to mutter. "Can some of you men carry her outside, please?" said Sam with an air of authority. "She needs air and water. Someone get some water. Leave her in the shade. I will be back presently." With that, he rushed out of the church in the direction of his house. Robert and Deputy Luke reached forward and carefully lifted her from the floor. Holly had to bite her tongue not to chastise the sheriff for not being among the men to lift her. Robert and Luke placed Rachel very gently on the ground outside the church. They positioned her in the shade as best they could to escape the baking heat. Mary magically appeared with a cup of water, which Rachel sipped gratefully. The sheriff hung back in the doorway, neither offering words of comfort nor inquiring as to her health. Holly couldn't help but shoot him evil glares at every available opportunity. Deputy Luke behaved in complete contrast to the sheriff. He asked if Rachel was comfortable and offered her his jacket to sit on. He behaved like a real gentleman, and Rachel looked at him with adoring eyes. Holly knew that Deputy Luke was the man Rachel should have married. But that was not to be, unfortunately. Suddenly, a flicker of pain twisted Rachel's face, and her hand automatically went down to her stomach. "What's the matter?" Holly asked as calmly as possible while giving Mary a worried look. Rachel looked up with fearful eyes. "Nothing, just a twinge. I must have hurt myself when I fell." Rachel looked across at the sheriff and then flashed Holly a warning look that said, "Be careful what you say." They could see Sam returning across the square with his bag in hand. It wasn't a moment too soon, as Rachel's face again contorted in pain. Mary thought quickly, "Why don't you gentlemen return to the service? Holly and I will stay with Rachel. The doc is coming back. She'll be fine. It's just a bit of heat stroke and a few bruises. We'll come and get you if she gets any worse." Luke and Robert nodded their heads and turned toward the door. "You too, Sheriff," Mary encouraged. "You can't do any good out here." He had no intention of doing any good, thought Holly. The sheriff looked over at his wife, who was doing her best to hide the pain. She nodded her head as though she thought Mary's idea was a good one. The sheriff gave a nod in return and a sigh that indicated his exasperation and disappeared back into the church. "Well done, Mary," said Holly quickly. She turned and saw Sam rapidly approaching the church. She had to talk to Rachel quickly. "Rachel, you have to tell Sam about your condition." Rachel's eyes narrowed in obvious fear, but Mary made encouraging noises as if agreeing with Holly. "I can't. What if he says something?" hissed Rachel, hardly keeping her eyes off the advancing Sam. Holly shook her head. "He won't. He'll keep it to himself, I'm sure. You need to tell him. The baby might be in danger." Rachel knew that Holly was right. It was pointless having a doctor there if he wasn't fully aware of the facts. Reluctantly, she agreed. "You tell him, though. I would die of shame." Mary bent down. "Don't be silly. You have nothing to be ashamed of, do you? That is your former husband's baby." Prosody, "The only thing you haven't done is tell your new husband, and that is perfectly understandable under the circumstances." While Mary was attempting to comfort Rachel, Holly was marching up the path to intercept Sam, well out of earshot of the church. She hurriedly explained the situation and the various complexities associated with it. Sam quickly agreed to keep the matter to himself. He didn't know the sheriff and certainly didn't feel compelled to tell him anything about his new wife. In fact, it had always been Sam's view that people's medical conditions should be kept private. Rachel looked weary as Sam approached, but he flashed his charming smile and spoke in his soft, disarming Irish accent. "Don't you worry now, Miss Rachel. I won't be telling anything to anyone. Now, let's check you over." Mary stood guard by the church door as Sam poked, prodded, listened to, and examined Rachel. After 10 minutes, he smiled once again. "There is no problem here, Miss Rachel," he said confidently. "Nothing more than a bout of heat stroke. Nothing else has been affected," Sam confirmed, glancing down at her stomach. "You need to be careful in the heat, though, miss, especially as you aren't used to it. We can't have you fainting and then falling over again. Not in your condition." "Thank you, Sam," said Rachel, ignoring the formalities of calling him doctor. "I think it would be best if we got you home, out of the heat. Do you agree?" Rachel nodded her head, thinking of nothing worse than returning to the heat of the church. "We'll come as well to make sure you are settled," said Holly, turning to Mary for confirmation. Mary smiled warmly. "Of course. The question is, when will the sheriff come to see his wife?" added Holly in obvious disgust. Chapter 16. After dinner that evening, Holly sat down beside the fire and thought herself both very fortunate and very tired. The sheriff had been in no rush to return to check on Rachel. He had sent Deputy Luke, leaving himself free to spend his time with the influential members of town after the service. Holly had thought it outrageous. Not that Rachel had complained. Holly saw the look of adoration on her face when Luke entered the room. After Rachel had assured them that she was quite all right, she and Mary had left her alone to recover. Luke was just along the passageway in his little office and had promised to check on her from time to time. Rachel had thought this a most agreeable arrangement. Holly had found Robert loitering outside the sheriff's office, and they quickly made their way to their appointment with the pastor. It didn't take long. Aside from Sunday services, the pastor was not a particularly busy man. Weddings were in short supply, and as a result, so were baptisms. He visited the sick and then buried them if they didn't recover. But the town wasn't that big, and the population wasn't particularly old. His last funeral was that of the previous doctor. Much of his time was spent at dinners with the townspeople and keeping the church looking nice. This meant that Robert and Holly could basically name the day. The date was fixed. 10 days hence. Holly could hardly believe it. In 10 days, she would be the mistress of Whitegate Ranch. She had a man who cared for her, a handsome man at that. She had a new sister who was a very engaging companion, and there was an exciting business to help run. The only fly in the ointment was the threat from the rustlers and her worries about poor Rachel. After the meeting with the pastor, she joined Mary at her gathering of the womenfolk of No Hope. She found herself the center of attention with the ladies who were all eager for news of the city. Holly told them what she could, but thought that they wanted more. Such was the desire for excitement in the small frontier town. Holly almost made up stories of fake adventures in the city just to please them. Her thoughts kept returning to Rachel's situation. It was obvious that she was madly in love with Luke. It also seemed clear, to her at least, that Luke was hiding feelings for Rachel. With the ineptitude of the sheriff and the worrying stories of his dubious character, it was clear that Luke would make a far better sheriff. Holly's brain raced, wondering if there was some way the sheriff could be exposed for his wrongdoings. That notwithstanding, Rachel would still be married to the man, and there would still be no escape. The problem made her brain hurt. It seemed simple enough. An event would have to occur that would expose Sheriff Lucas, an event that would result in Rachel's marriage to the man being annulled. Luke could then be made sheriff, and Rachel would be free to marry him. Even if such a seemingly impossible solution could be found, Luke would still have to accept that Rachel was secretly carrying another man's child. Although Luke appeared somewhat affable and was everything the sheriff was not, it was still far from certain that he would want to marry a pregnant woman. Mary joined her in a rocker beside the fire. "How were the accounts?" Holly asked. "A little better than I expected, truth be told," said Mary with a smile. "Good thing, really, as there is a wedding to pay for." "There will be no grand affair," Holly said sternly. "I want there to be no expense." "You must have a wedding dress," Mary replied. "Every bride needs a wedding dress." Holly remembered her marriage to Arthur, which was certainly no grand affair, and she simply wore her best dress for the occasion. She had planned to do the same for this wedding. Don't be silly. Press. A special wedding dress is a frivolous expense. The accounts may be better than expected, but they won't remain that way if we purchase such unnecessary niceties, Holly retorted, although secretly her heart yearned to be standing in the church in a beautiful white wedding dress. Mary grinned. She knew perfectly well that Holly would love to have such a dress, despite her protests. "I've been speaking to Robert. There is a way to get that dress at little expense." Holly looked inquisitively at Mary, and for a second her heart froze. Had Robert kept Rose's wedding dress somewhere? Were they going to suggest she get married in Robert's dead wife's dress? She wasn't what you might call superstitious, but she thought that would be a very bad omen. "There is a rancher over in Spring Creek whose sister is a seamstress. Max Winter is his name. We do a lot of business over there, or rather we did. He owes us a small sum, and so the business stopped a while back. We are going to suggest that the sum be repaid with a wedding dress." Holly began to protest. "Look, Holly, the sum has been outstanding for a while. We had basically written it off and assumed that we would never see it. This is a perfectly acceptable solution. The debt will be paid off, and then we will be free to resume a business relationship with the rancher as well, as his embarrassment would be alleviated. It works well for everyone. Well, if Robert is sure, said Holly nervously, somewhat concerned that money for the business would be spent on niceties for her. Of course, I'm sure, Robert said, appearing at the appropriate moment. Holly stood, rushed over, and hugged him. Oh, Robert, I don't need these things to be happy, you know. I know, he whispered, but I also know they help. Everyone laughed. Thank you as well, Mary, added Holly, hugging her as well. I know it was all your idea. This time, it was Mary's turn to protest. So, my suggestion is that we go to Spring Creek the day after next, said Robert. It is a day's travel in the cart, so we will be gone 3 days. My concern is the rustlers, of course. Eli said all would be fine. He and the others will make sure everything is looked after while we are gone. He knows perfectly well that re-engaging business with Max is important. If we don't start doing more business, the rustlers may as well take everything anyway, Mary said knowingly. It was obvious to Holly that Mary was critical to the well-being of the ranch. There was no way that she would be able to understand the business aspects as Mary did. Right, since we are going to be away for a while, I'm going to take tonight's watch, said Robert. Since setting up the watches at night, they had instituted a halfway solution. The man on watch would actually bed down in the barn with the cattle. If the doors were open, the man would wake. It didn't make for a particularly comfortable night's sleep, but at least it was sleep. I will bid you ladies good night, he said before disappearing out the door. Good night, Robert, both Holly and Mary managed to utter before the door shut behind him. Mary stared at Holly. Are you excited? Holly's eyes glinted. Most certainly. A wedding dress. I would never have thought it. I'm excited too, said Mary. I've only ever been to Spring Creek once in my life. It will be interesting to go on a return visit. Many people from No Hope used to live there, you know. Mr. Jones at the mercantile store, for one. Sheriff Lucas as well, I believe. That sparked Holly's interest. How long has Lucas been sheriff here? I'm not sure, maybe just over a year, said Mary as she racked her brains. However, he only got elected because he was the only man standing. The previous sheriff, God rest his soul, had been shot in the only bank robbery in the town's history. The menfolk thought that a new wave of lawlessness was coming to town, and no one wanted to stand. So John Lucas was an unknown, but he got the job almost by default? Pretty much, agreed Mary. No one knew anything about him. I can't even remember what he used to do over at Spring Creek. I'm not sure he ever said. He did a fine job of cozying up to the mayor and other important folks. Still does, of course. That's what he was doing, instead of looking after Rachel today. Holly nodded, deep in thought. What are you thinking? Mary demanded. Does anyone know anything about the sheriff's past? Mary shook her head. Not to my knowledge. You met the ladies today. If someone knew something, then as a collective they would be sure to know. Holly knew that Mary was right. The ladies of No Hope knew everything and everyone. Am I right in saying that not many folks from town visit Spring Creek? Sure. Spring Creek was a rich relation to No Hope for almost as long as I can remember, but over the last 5 or 6 years, the town's prospects took a hit. That's why Mr. Jones started business out here. There wasn't enough business going on over there. People from Spring Creek visit here, not the other way around. Maybe we could ask some questions about Sheriff Lucas while we are there, suggested Holly. Just see what people know. I don't see why not. The wedding dress fitting won't take all day, and Robert is sure to be busy with his business. Holly smiled in response. Maybe there was something other than a wedding dress awaiting her in Spring Creek. Chapter 17. They arrived at Spring Creek at a little after 6 that evening. Holly thought her bones would never stop aching again after such a long ride. She could understand why so few people made the trip between the towns. Robert had insisted that she and Mary get settled in at the inn. There wasn't much concern that the place would be full, as the inn had been built during Spring Creek's prosperity, and these days it was almost empty. Instead of coming with them, Robert would seek out Max and put his proposal to him. He knew from experience that Max was unlikely to be at his ranch and more likely to be in the saloon. A saloon was no place for a pair of ladies such as Holly and Mary. Robert joined them after a few hours, his face flushed with drink and further plastered with a wide smile. Max agreed, he said proudly. It only took 2 drinks as well. He took a sideways glance at Holly, but she didn't seem to care. She had learned that Robert wasn't much of a drinker, so an occasional whiskey with fellow ranchers wasn't a cause for reproach. He took me right off to see his sister. Because we have so little time, you ladies are to be at her shop at 7 in the morning. She has something she believes she can adapt for you within a day. Holly flashed a grin at Mary. She couldn't help but feel excited. I feel so guilty, though. Robert put up his hand. No, none of that. I'm going over to Max's ranch in the morning to see what future business we can do. I also met Carl Bridge in the saloon. I don't know if you remember him, Mary? Mary shook her head. He is the son of Jacob Bridge, Bridgegate Ranch, a few miles west of here. Jacob died 2 months ago and Carl has taken over, and there may be business prospects there as well. Carl is keen to modernize Bridgegate. His father had been so reluctant to change, so I doubt I will be back here any time before 6 tomorrow. Will you two be all right? Of course, replied Mary. There isn't much trouble we can get up to at a wedding dress fitting, right? Robert smiled and nodded his agreement. Let's find somewhere to eat, shall we? At a little before 7, Mary and Holly found themselves outside Max Winter's sister's small shop. She opened the door with a half-hearted smile at the stroke of 7. She introduced herself as Summer and told a quick story about how her father had thought it funny to name her Summer Winter and how she had never been able to find herself a man since. Holly and Mary simply found themselves nodding. She pulled a half-finished dress from the rails. This is what I was thinking. There is simply no time to get something made from scratch, you understand. It was a simple dress with a little lace around the neck and shoulders, but Holly thought it the most beautiful dress she had ever seen. Oh, yes, I love it, she almost squealed. Mary, what do you think? Mary nodded her head. It's lovely. Come on, try it on. 15 minutes later, Holly was on a stool in the middle of the shop as Summer pinned, tucked, and adjusted the dress. They were told Summer's life story in that time, not that there was much to tell. She didn't want to be married to a rancher like her father, or a prospector who basically lived on hope. She was fussy. As such, she had reached the age of 32 without marrying. She wasn't compromising her stance for anyone. If she died a spinster, she would die a spinster, was her position on the matter. She didn't care. Holly secretly thought that she cared very much indeed. When Summer finally stopped talking, Mary ventured a question. Do you recall John Lucas? I believe he lived here. He is the sheriff in No Hope now. Summer sucked on the needle she held expertly in her mouth and thought, nope. Been no John Lucas living in Spring Creek. Not ever that I recall. Mary shot Holly a suspicious look. Holly realized that if Summer couldn't remember such a man, then no one would. There was a Lucas Rochester that lived here for a while. Although I don't recall ever seeing him, he was only around a few months, caused a bit of a scandal around these parts. He was carrying on with Marge West, who had only been a widow for a month or so. Folks thought it a little unseemly. Holly couldn't help but think of Rachel. What on earth would Summer say about her situation? Unseemly would hardly seem to cover the situation. Summer continued her story. He had some money, this Lucas, probably why Marge went for him. You can't blame a widow for seeking a bit of security, you know. Anyhow, he made her pregnant and then disappeared into the night. Never seen again. That was about 18 months ago. Goodness, what a man, said a horrified Mary. Terrible, agreed Holly, but he wasn't the first, and he certainly wouldn't be the last. However, it brought them no closer to finding out anything about John Lucas. Right, declared Summer, taking a step back and admiring her work. We are done. Well, you are done. I've got a day's work on this ahead of me. If you can be back here at 4 for a final fitting, everything should be done. Thank you so much, said Holly. My pleasure, Summer almost spat out. Holly thought she probably resented having to give up a dress and her time to pay off her brother's debt. She would probably feel the same, so she wasn't about to blame her. Holly very carefully climbed out of the wedding dress and changed back into her own dress. Within 5 minutes, she and Mary found themselves on the streets of Spring Creek, blinking against the sunlight. They decided on a breakfast. This was the problem with traveling. Basic needs always ended up costing money. But there was nothing to be done. They returned to the inn where they had dined with Robert the previous night. They wouldn't have felt comfortable in there alone in the evening, but at this time of the morning, the drunks were still sleeping off hangovers, leaving just a smattering of sober clients about the place, all eating breakfast, just like Holly and Mary. As soon as she started eating, Holly realized how hungry she was. Being fitted for a wedding dress clearly gave a woman an appetite, she decided. They discussed Sheriff John Lucas and how it was strange that Summer hadn't heard of him. Maybe he just wasn't the sort of person Summer would have heard about, ventured Holly. I doubt that. Fitting ladies for dresses all day long? She would find out anything and everything that happened in the town, replied Mary with the wisdom of a woman who had lived out west all her life. Mrs. Rothermere, who owned the place, came over and checked that everything was acceptable with their meal. As she was about to leave, Mary asked her, "Excuse me, do you ever recall a John Lucas living in Spring Creek, probably just over a year ago?" Mrs. Rothermere thought for a second. "No, miss, I can't say I do, and I remember most folks around here." Mary nodded, and Mrs. Rothermere turned to leave. But before she did so, Holly added, "What about Lucas Rochester? Do you remember him?" "Oh, yes, who wouldn't?" Leaving poor Marge in that situation. "Good woman is Marge," replied the old woman. "Tell me, Mrs. Rothermere, could you possibly describe this Lucas Rochester?" asked Holly on the spur of the moment. "He wasn't much to look at, I can tell you that. It was a good job he had money. Otherwise, no woman would have looked twice at him, I'm sure of that," said Mrs. Rothermere. "He was a little fat man, balding somewhat on top, if I recall, but he never seemed to keep himself tidy, which was strange considering he had money. Always had stains on his shirts, all the time, I do remember that. I offered him a laundry service once, but he didn't want to pay." Holly shot a glance at Mary, who looked back with immediate recognition at the description. "How old was this man, Mrs. Rothermere?" Mary asked. "Oh, about 40, I would say, but he could have been younger. A man like that who had let himself go, it is a little hard to tell," she replied. "Thank you for that. The food was delicious," Holly said, wiping her mouth with the little napkin that had been provided. "One last thing. Where would we find Marge West?" Chapter 18. The day after Robert, Holly, and Mary returned to Whitegate Ranch, the ladies took a trip into No Hope. Robert had allowed Holly to drive the cart for part of the journey back from Spring Creek, and he was now confident enough to allow the women to visit town on their own. The purpose of their visit was twofold. First, Holly wanted to check up on Rachel, and second, they wanted to invite anyone and everyone to the wedding. During their final night in Spring Creek, they had discussed all they had discovered with Robert. It took them a little time to bring him up to speed, but as soon as he fully understood, it didn't take him very long to come up with a plan. The plan centered on their wedding. Holly was more than happy to make use of this opportunity to execute their scheme, as it was all designed to help her friend. For it to work effectively, as many people as possible had to be present at church, and this was their reason for visiting, to invite as many people as they could to the wedding. The ladies visited only the womenfolk of the town, knowing perfectly well that they would all love to attend a wedding, anything to break the monotony of a normal week. The men would simply do as their wives told them. An hour or so out of their day wouldn't be a great loss, especially if the whole town was going to be there anyway. The mayor's wife insisted they come in for coffee and cake. They chatted idly for almost an hour before Holly remembered that they had a job to do. They left with the assurance that she and her husband would be in the church on the day. Holly was thrilled. She would be getting as grand a wedding as she could hope for, and the most important townspeople would be present for what was to come afterward. Not one person they visited said they were unavailable. Everything was going to plan. The final stop on their trip was to the sheriff. On this occasion, they reversed matters, and instead of inviting Rachel, Holly insisted on speaking to Sheriff Lucas directly. "Well, I would be most honored to attend," he confirmed. "Excellent. You could sit with the mayor, as you normally do," said Holly, ensuring that Lucas was aware that the important people of the town were all coming. "You know that Rachel means a lot to me. It will be a pleasure for her to share my day." "Well, I hope she is well enough to attend. She hasn't fully recovered from that incident at the church. I've had to go to the saloon 3 times this week for my dinner," Lucas said with a shake of his head. "Has the doctor been out again?" demanded Mary, thinking of the baby. "Oh no, it's not worth that expense," replied Lucas. "She will be well enough, soon enough. Otherwise she won't be able to come to your wedding, will she?" "No, I suppose not," replied Holly, full of concern. "Will we be able to go through? I'd like to invite her personally, if I may." "Indeed," replied Lucas, waving his hand toward the back room. "Thank you, Sheriff," the women muttered with as much jollity as they could muster. Imagine a man being more concerned about the expense of a doctor than the well-being of his wife. Although neither would say that it came as a surprise. Luke was behind his desk as they filed past, and he leaped to his feet as soon as he saw them. He put a finger to his lips in a bid to silence them. "I'm so relieved to see you two," he whispered while looking over their shoulder toward the doorway where Lucas might appear at any moment. "Rachel has seemed so down since the incident at the church. She hardly gets up out of the chair. I've asked the sheriff for the doctor to be sent for, but he won't hear of it." This simply confirmed to Holly that Luke was madly in love with Rachel. "Prosody, you'll make someone a lovely husband one day, Deputy Luke," whispered Holly back to him. "Perhaps," said Luke, looking forlornly down the corridor toward where Rachel would be in the chair. "We'll see to Rachel," said Holly, "but do continue to look out for her, won't you?" "I will, miss," assured Luke before returning to his desk. Holly and Mary walked into the sitting room. Rachel looked up and smiled. She got to her feet. "How delightful to see you both." "Be careful, Rachel," Holly said, noticing that she seemed a little unstable on her feet. "The sheriff tells us you've not been well since church," said Mary. "Oh, I've felt better than I've let on. I simply didn't want to run around after him all hours, that's all," said Rachel. "Right. Sit down. I'll make coffee." "I'll make the coffee," said Mary. "You just sit back down. Holly has things to say." "Are you sure you are well? Luke tells us that you haven't been yourself," said Holly, softly taking one of Rachel's hands in her own. "You have been eating, haven't you?" "Luke is a gentleman, isn't he?" Rachel said. "I get the impression he would do anything for me." "I think he would, Rachel," Holly agreed. "Listen, if you really feel all right, then you need to pull yourself together. I need you at my wedding in a few days. It's important." "Finally," said Rachel, genuinely pleased for her friend. "Of course. I'll be there. I wouldn't miss it for the world. I've invited the sheriff as well." Rachel's face dropped at the mention of her husband. Holly squeezed her hand. "Listen, it is terribly important that he is there, and it is just as important that you are by his side. I can't tell you why. I just might have a solution that gets you out of this situation." "What?" said Rachel excitedly, getting to her feet. "Careful," insisted Holly. "Keep your voice down." Rachel nodded, understanding that she didn't want the sheriff coming in at a moment like this. "Why can't you tell me?" she asked. "Because it's important that you don't know. You'll have to trust me. You do trust me, don't you?" Rachel offered a wide smile, the first Holly had seen since their arrival in No Hope. "Yes, Holly, I trust you." "Good. Just make sure that you get the sheriff to church on time." Chapter 19. Rachel had been physically better than she had been letting on to her husband. However, she had been touched by melancholy, but that was because she knew it was rapidly approaching the time that she would have to tell Lucas about her condition. There was no way that she could pass the child off as his, because nothing had changed in his attention toward her. With this realization, she had fallen into the black swirl of melancholy, and she simply didn't want to do anything, as opposed to being physically incapable of doing anything. But the day following Holly's and Mary's visit, she was positively bouncing around and feeling like a new woman. There was now hope for Rachel in No Hope. Even though neither Holly nor Mary had shared any details, she trusted them implicitly. If they said there could be a way out for her, she would take it, whatever it was. She decided that she needed fresh air. After satisfying herself that her dress wasn't too tight, she ventured outside for the first time in a week. She planned to walk across the square to see Sam and thank him for his kindness, but he didn't seem to be home. Instead, she decided to walk down to the mercantile. She knew she had to keep Lucas happy for a few days, so she intended to cook him a special pie for dinner. Food seemed to be the only way to keep the man interested, and she would play to it over the next few days with a series of delightful dinners. She greeted people with a polite nod of the head as she walked past, but didn't stop to engage in small talk with anyone. A little way ahead, she saw the unmistakable bulk of her husband slide awkwardly off his horse. He seemed to look around suspiciously, almost as if he were expecting to be watched or find himself under scrutiny. Odd, thought Rachel. He tethered his horse and then slipped inside a house a little further along. She had no idea to whom the house belonged, but she quickened her pace. The house was easy to spot because it wasn't white as was the norm, but rather a pale, washed-out red color, and it sat on the corner of two streets. She walked straight past it, showing not the slightest interest, before taking a left down a narrow alleyway. She managed to find her way around to approach the red house from the back. She silently climbed up onto the wooden porch and heard her husband's unmistakable drawl. "I'm telling you, the ranch will be empty. He is getting married." Whoever he was speaking to offered an observation that she couldn't hear. "No, those ranch hands are sure to be there as well. I'm telling you, they are inviting everyone in town. The ranch will be deserted." Again, whoever he was speaking to must have made a comment. "Well, hide up and watch them go past if you don't believe me. There are 6 of them. Him, her, the sister, and the 3 ranch hands. You'll be able to count them from a distance. There can be no finger-pointing from Parsons because everyone is going to be here at his wedding. I'll tell him he as good as invited you rustlers himself." The person Rachel assumed to be a man spoke again. "Come on, this has to be worth at least double last time. You are going to wipe the man out. You could take the entire herd if you wanted, and you'll have time to spare." The realization hit Rachel that her husband was informing a criminal that Whitegate Ranch would be unguarded on the day of the wedding. He was going to ruin Robert and Holly while they were getting married. Holly was acting in her best interests, so Rachel made the decision to do likewise for Holly. She returned the way she had come, marching straight past the house in which her husband was currently conducting his shady business. Fortune was on her side as she found Luke manning the main desk back at the sheriff's office. His eyes lit up when Rachel walked in, but she had no time for that right now, no matter her feelings for him. She hurriedly told him all she had heard. "This is unbelievable," declared Luke, jumping to his feet. "I knew that he was lazy and I understood that, but this is an entirely different matter. Apologies, miss. I know he is your husband," he added as an afterthought. "Come on, Luke," Rachel said, her hands on her hips. "I'm no more than his housekeeper. You can see the way he treats me. There is no affection. I'm his wife because the piece of paper says so, and that's all. Ours is not a proper marriage." She paused for a second, almost admitting to her desire for a proper marriage to him, but she controlled herself. Now wasn't the time. "This man is going to ruin the Parsons on their wedding day. We can't let that happen. We need to warn them." Luke nodded. "Right. Can you ride a horse?" "No," Rachel responded. "Not many city girls can." "You can fit in front of me in the saddle," Luke said. Rachel hesitated, wondering whether this might endanger the baby. Luke, obviously oblivious to Rachel's condition, misconstrued her distress. "Very few people are out there, but if you are worried about being seen riding with a man other than your husband, we can." "Not at all," Rachel said, cutting him short. "Holly's future is at stake here, and I want to do everything I can to help." She wanted to add that she would be proud to be seen riding with him, but decided that she should keep her feelings to herself until all the matters at hand were properly resolved. Holly had a plan to help her. Now Rachel had to share what she knew to help her friend. "Let's go. Just ride carefully." Yes, ma'am, Luke agreed and opened the door for her to exit first. What a gentleman, she thought, not for the first time. He patted his horse on the muzzle. I have a special load for you today, Crimson. Be sure of your footing. The lady wants a gentle ride. Then he turned to Rachel. If you'll allow me. She nodded her agreement, and in a fluid motion, he lifted her effortlessly skyward and gently placed her in the saddle before jumping up behind her. Rachel flushed at the feel of Luke's muscular body pressing into her and told herself to keep her mind on the task at hand. Sorry, Miss Rachel, we are going to be kinda close. Don't let me fall, she breathlessly whispered. Don't worry, Luke said and slid his strong arm around her. He kicked his heels, and Crimson sprang forward into a gallop. Rachel's heart raced. She wasn't sure whether it was due to Crimson's speed or Luke's closeness, but for the first time in a very long time, Rachel felt as though she was alive. She looked back at the disappearing town of No Hope and smiled. Chapter 20. Holly and Mary were having coffee on the porch when Rachel and Luke rode into the yard in a storm of dust. Rachel, Holly shouted, leaping to her feet with Mary. What on earth are you doing here? What's wrong? Luke, what's happened? Is it the sheriff? She didn't even pause for them to answer her questions. Her first thought was that the sheriff had found out about the baby and had threatened Rachel or thrown her out. Yes, it's to do with the sheriff, Luke said, dismounting and turning to gently help Rachel down. Holly rushed down the steps and hugged her friend. Are you all right? Did he find out? She whispered in her ear. Rachel laughed, still elated from the horse ride. No, it's not that. She changed her demeanor in tune with the gravity of the moment. It's about you and Robert and the ranch. He told the people behind the rustling about your wedding and how your ranch would be unattended. They are planning on taking everything. Oh my, Mary said, raising her hand to her face in shock. David, she shouted at the boy working on the far side of the yard. Go and find Robert now. Tell him to get back here immediately. Take a horse, quickly. David rushed off, keen to please Mary. Come on, Holly insisted, pulling Rachel toward the porch. You too, Deputy. You must be thirsty after the ride. Let's make some coffee while we wait for Robert. There is no point in telling the story twice. Mary busied herself in the kitchen while Holly made Rachel comfortable in a rocker. Are you sure that horseback riding is a good idea? She asked, in a voice low enough for Luke not to overhear. Deputy, Mary shouted from inside, almost on cue. Could you help bring chairs out to the porch for me, please? Sure thing, Miss Mary, replied Luke and disappeared inside. I didn't have any choice, Holly, said Rachel softly. I had to warn you. You're my friend, and with everything you've done for me. Oh, shush. Don't be silly. Anyway, I've not done anything yet. Just keep your fingers crossed that everything goes well on the wedding day. Holly's eyes went upward toward the bedrooms when she said this, as though looking for something. Rachel didn't seem to notice, though. I feel better than I have for a long time, Rachel insisted. She looked over at Luke as he came back out of the house with a chair under each arm. Luke looked after me just fine. Holly squeezed her hand. I bet he did. The two women laughed as Luke disappeared back inside, answering another summons from Mary. Luke returned with a tray of coffee cups, a coffee pot, and a plate of buns. We must have buns, Mary said as she emerged. I mean, we hardly ever have folks visit. I regret it's not really a social call, Mary, Rachel said. Well, maybe we'll have time for all of that in a month or so, added Holly. Robert joined them before too long and was somewhat shocked to find them all drinking coffee and eating buns. David said there was something amiss. Deputy? Luke stood up. Mr. Parsons, sorry for intruding like this, especially as I know you are so busy this week with the wedding and all, but Mrs. Lucas has important news and it isn't of the good kind, I'm afraid. Rachel told her story and left nothing out, even down to Sam Coates not being home. Robert frowned. That house is the old Barnett place. Widow Barnett died, 6 months back? She had no one to leave it to, so it's been empty ever since. Seems like these folks have moved in then, Luke said. What are we to do? Robert asked with a sideways glance at Holly. Holly's immediate thought was to cancel the wedding. It could take place at another time. Keeping the business afloat was more important than anything else. But what of Robert's plan regarding the sheriff and Rachel? With Sheriff Lucas being behind this, Holly was sure Robert wouldn't want to miss this opportunity. "Well, I have a plan if you care to listen," Luke declared. "Absolutely, Deputy," replied Robert. "This is the town's opportunity to catch these rustlers once and for all. Now, they are expecting there to be no one here. They think the place will be deserted. What if that wasn't the case? What if I get a posse together and we are waiting for them? I could get myself 10 good men from the town. 10 won't be missed, and then another 10 or so from the neighboring ranches. They will all be wanting to see this gang behind bars above all else. You folks go to your wedding and leave it to us." "But remember what Rachel said," interrupted Holly. "The sheriff told the rustlers to watch out and make sure we all leave. The ranch hands as well. If they are watching out, they'll see you arrive." "Not if we arrive the night before. We can get ourselves hidden away in the barn, in the ranch hands' quarters, and we'll even have a few folks here, just in case. Then they'll get themselves a nice surprise. There will be men wherever they turn. We'll round them up and then get them to confess to Sheriff Lucas being their informant. He'll be caught up in the middle of it." Luke looked over at Rachel. "I don't know where that will leave you, though, Miss Rachel. You'll be married to a common criminal who will most likely be jailed." "Don't worry about that, Luke," Rachel said. "Everyone here is fully aware that there is no affection between that man and me. We have to do what is good for the town. What happens to me and my standing afterward is of no concern." "I think it will work," said Robert, breaking the silence. "The worst that could happen is that the rustlers would hear of the posse and not attempt their theft." There was a general murmur of agreement around the porch. "Do you think you'll be able to raise the men without the sheriff finding out?" Mary asked. "I think so. There isn't a wealth of love for him in town, from what I can see," Luke replied. "I'll give you a list of names before you go," Mary said, thinking back to the women's gatherings. "These folks have particular reason to mistrust Lucas." "Thank you, miss," said Luke with a little nod of his head. "So the plan is agreed?" Robert said to everyone. Again, there was a general murmur of consent. "I'll be here at midnight, the night before the wedding," added Luke. "I think it is going to be a rather momentous week in the history of No Hope. We had better be getting back. We don't want the sheriff out looking for you, Miss Rachel." "I doubt he'll even know I'm gone," replied Rachel with a laugh. Then her face dropped and she let out a little cry of anguish. "I have nothing to give him for dinner. I was on my way to the mercantile when this happened." Holly stood up. "Well, you need to keep him sweet for these last few days," she uttered with a telling stare. "I tell you what, I'll give you the pie we made for dinner earlier. You can warm it through when you get back." "I couldn't take your dinner," Rachel protested, throwing her hands up in horror. "Don't be silly. We can fix something else," Mary insisted, "especially after what you've done for us today." Holly disappeared inside to emerge later with the biggest pie Rachel had ever seen. "Goodness, how many folks are you feeding?" Rachel asked, laughing. "To be fair, he'll probably eat most of that himself with no difficulty." Holly's eyes glanced up at the bedroom window again, but once again, no one noticed. Chapter 21. "Get yourself out of this house this minute, Robert Parsons," Mary almost shouted. "You'll not be seeing the bride before the wedding. It's bad luck." "But I can't expect her to drive herself to church." "Why not? She'll have me with her. Eli, will you get this man into town, please?" Mary demanded, switching the conversation to the old ranch hand. "Yes, miss," Eli said with a grin. "Come on, Robert. You have a wedding to get to." The 3 men of the posse who were to wait inside the house, each armed with a shotgun, were now in Robert's sitting room, all grinning widely at the master of the ranch being told off by his younger sister. Reluctantly, he shook his head. "Take care on the ride. Will you now go?" Mary spat out in mock frustration. Finally, Eli put his arm around Robert's shoulder and led him out to where Jasper was waiting with a cart. "At last," Mary said to the men, who all laughed. "Now I can go and help the bride get ready." 45 minutes later, Holly walked into the sitting room and the men all rose to their feet and took off their hats. "You look beautiful, miss," one ventured respectfully. Mary followed her. "Wait, let's cover that dress with a shawl. Otherwise, you'll be covered in dust by the time we get there. She grasped the biggest one and expertly brought it around over Holly's shoulders with her one arm. There, perfect. Holly turned to the men. Good luck. You too, miss, one replied with a smile. As they rode away, Mary turned back. I hope all of this is still here when we get back. Of course it will be. You saw how many men Luke had with him. Let's just hope the rustlers don't have more. They rode on in contemplative silence. Luke waited until the cart carrying Holly and Mary had disappeared from sight before he moved from his hiding place. He had been at Whitegate since midnight and had slept no more than a few minutes. Most of the men he had gathered were concealed in the barns, the ranch hands' quarters, and behind the outbuildings. The three men left inside the ranch house had strict instructions to stay away from the windows. For a while, nothing happened. The ranch was so quiet that Luke could hear cattle calling to one another in the distance. He began to wonder whether the sheriff's friends had changed their minds. Perhaps they had spotted something suspicious. Perhaps one of the men in town had talked. If the rustlers failed to appear, the whole plan would come to nothing. Then Luke saw movement beyond the northern boundary. A faint cloud of dust rose above the hard ground and slowly grew larger. He crouched lower behind a stack of timber and raised one hand. Around the ranch, men who had been waiting for hours became perfectly still. 7 riders came into view. They did not approach like men worried about being seen. They rode directly toward the cattle, confident that Whitegate Ranch had been abandoned for the morning. The man at their head was broad across the shoulders and wore a dark red neckerchief. Luke had heard that red neckerchief described often enough in town to know he was looking at the leader of the gang. The leader halted and looked toward the ranch house. Looks empty enough, he called to the others. Lucas was right. Everybody is in town. Luke felt his jaw tighten at the sheriff's name, but he did nothing. This was not the moment to move. He watched as 2 men rode toward the main herd, while another pair headed for the corral. The remaining men spread themselves around the yard. They were doing exactly what Luke had hoped they would do, separating themselves until they could no longer support one another. One of the rustlers swung down from his horse and started toward a gate. Luke waited until the man had his hand on the latch. That is far enough, he shouted. Every head in the yard turned. Luke stepped from behind the timber with his revolver drawn. At the same instant, armed men appeared from the barn doors, from behind the bunkhouse, and from either side of the ranch house. In a matter of seconds, the rustlers found themselves surrounded by more guns than Luke hoped they could count. One of the younger men reached toward the pistol at his hip. I wouldn't, Luke warned. Nobody needs to die here today. A shotgun was cocked somewhere behind the rustler. The young man slowly lifted both hands away from his weapon. The leader stared around the ranch and then fixed his eyes on Luke. You set us up. Seems to me you set yourselves up, Luke replied. You came here to steal cattle from a ranch you believed was empty. He paused. Your friend in the sheriff's office won't be able to help you this time. The man's expression changed immediately. Lucas, he spat. That fool swore the whole place would be empty, said there was a wedding and every last man would be in town. Luke almost smiled. He had hoped for a confession eventually. He had not expected the man to hand him one before the ropes were even tied. You all heard that, he called to the posse. Several men answered that they had. The rustlers knew when they were beaten. One by one, their guns were removed and their hands were bound. Not a single shot was fired. Luke looked toward the town and thought of the wedding already getting underway. Take 6 men and get these prisoners to the jail, he ordered one of the ranchers. Then he caught hold of the leader's rope. This one comes with me. The man glared at him. Where are you taking me? To a wedding, Luke replied. There is somebody there who is going to be very interested to see you. Robert was pacing outside the church, waiting for the guests to arrive, shocked that he felt so nervous. He tried telling himself that it was because of the events playing out alongside the wedding, but he knew he was lying to himself. He was nervous because he was marrying Holly. The nerves were a good sign, he told himself, confirmation that he was doing the right thing. He could hardly believe that he was marrying again after what had happened to Rose, yet he knew in his heart that she would be happy for him. Holly was a truly wonderful woman, and he was fortunate indeed to have been blessed with two such women in his life. The guests began to arrive, and he smiled and politely shook the hand of each one. Some of the women came alone. Robert knew perfectly well that was because their husbands were on his ranch, waiting for the arrival of the cattle rustlers. Each of those women gave him a telling look, and he responded with a silent nod of gratitude. The mayor arrived and proceeded to give Robert a lengthy speech on keeping a woman happy. His wife interrupted him, reminding him that Robert had been married before. Robert couldn't help but grin, thinking that the mayor had a trickier job than most, keeping his wife happy. Now all that was needed was Rachel and the sheriff. Just as he began to panic that they weren't coming, he saw the sheriff's unmistakable bulk swaggering over the square with Rachel on his arm. To any new acquaintance, they would appear to be a perfectly happy, if somewhat mismatched couple. "Good morning, Sheriff. So glad that you are able to be here today," Robert offered as a greeting, even though he would rather have punched him on the nose. To think that the man responsible for law and order was helping criminals. "Sure thing, Mr. Parsons. You seem to have the whole town here," he replied, tilting his head toward the church. "You brought your whole staff from the ranch?" If Robert didn't know better, it would have seemed a perfectly innocent question, but he knew that the duplicitous sheriff was delving to make sure that his criminal friends wouldn't expect any nasty surprises when they arrived. "Yes, sir," agreed Robert. "None of them wanted to miss this. And how are you, Mrs. Lucas?" "Just fine, thank you very much. I'm so pleased for Holly today. We have such a bond after traveling down together, you know." "Indeed, a fortunate chance of fate, you sharing the compartment on the train like that. Don't you agree, Sheriff?" "Most fortunate," replied Lucas with the look of a man who had no idea why it should be the case. "Well, we had better take our seats. Let's hope the bride shows, Parsons." For a second, Robert's heart was in his mouth, wondering if the sheriff and his villainous friends had concocted a kidnapping or worse. But he saw out of the corner of his eye movement on the far side of the square and the familiar sight of Samson pulling a cart carrying two female figures. "They're here. We had better hurry up and get inside," Rachel said to her husband, gently pulling on his arm. "You too, Mr. Parsons." The sheriff managed a perfunctory nod and allowed his wife to guide him into the church. Robert gazed a moment longer at Samson pulling his bride closer and turned to look northward. His eyes fell over the churchyard toward the far wall, where he picked out the crosses of his mother and father, and then of Rose and little Edward. The past was the past, he told himself. The future now awaited. He turned back to Eli. "I guess this is it." "She'll make you a fine wife, Robert," he half whispered back in a gentle voice. "Rose would have wanted you to do this, you know." I know, right? It's time to get married." Chapter 22. Holly walked nervously up the aisle with over 100 pairs of eyes on her. She clutched a small posy of white and blue flowers in her hand and kept her eyes demurely down. When she was 10 yards from the front, she finally raised her eyes and saw Robert's handsome, smiling face staring back at her. She quickened her step, eager to get close to his reassuring presence. "You look wonderful," Robert said in a soft voice. The dress that Summer had made was simple but stunning. By simply removing the lace, it could be used for her Sunday best each and every week. Holly was glad of this. It made her feel less guilty about the cost. She already had plans to embroider the lace she would remove from it onto a new christening gown that, God willing, their child would wear. "Thank you. You clean up well yourself," she whispered. Robert gave a soft laugh. Over the previous 3 days, Mary had been adjusting, cleaning, and pressing his best suit of clothes. Mary had to let it out a little and declared that pies would have to stop at the ranch. Robert said it was a sign of contentment and to let the clothes out an extra inch and let the pies continue. The pastor cleared his throat in a manner that suggested the small talk between the couple should end and the important business of the service begin. "Dearly beloved," he began in his soothing tone, We are gathered here in the sight of God to witness the marriage of this man and this woman." Holly looked across at Robert and realized how lucky she had been. It could have been her in the front row in Rachel's place, next to a vile, villainous man who showed her no affection. Instead, she was marrying a strong, handsome man who cared for her. She thought back to that awful Valentine's Day as she watched Arthur's coffin being lowered into the ground. Life had its moments of pain, but it was amazing how it balanced it with moments of happiness. God was wondrous in all things. The service passed in a wave of bliss for Holly. As they exchanged vows and Robert slipped the simple gold band on her finger, she immediately felt the completeness that had been missing from her life for so long. On the pastor's command, Robert leaned down and gently kissed her. It was the most magical sensation in the world. Holly's stomach flipped as though 1,000 butterflies had all taken off at once. Once again, she was a married woman. The pastor offered a final prayer and was just about to dismiss everyone when the church doors were flung open and a woman of around 30 years of age entered the church carrying a baby. Those toward the rear of the church turned their heads to see the new arrival. No one had seen this person before today. She walked halfway up the aisle before she shouted, "I've come to see the man you folks know as Sheriff John Lucas." As she spoke, young David from the ranch slipped into the church behind her, closed the door, and stood in front of it. Despite his youth, he was nonetheless tall and broad from working the ranch. The message was clear: no one was leaving the church. The pastor started to move forward to confront the woman, but Robert held out an arm to stop him. "Let her speak, and this business be done," he said to him in nothing more than a whisper. The sheriff's head turned, and he could scarcely believe his eyes. The shock was evident to all those close to him. Rachel then saw the shock in his eyes turn to something else. It took a moment for her to understand what it was, and then she worked it out. It was fear. Rachel turned her head to Holly and gave her a look as if to ask what on earth was going on. Holly responded with a look of her own that Rachel interpreted as wait and see. "Where are you?" the mysterious woman demanded, her eyes flicking from pew to pew. Finally, she saw him in the front row. She stopped in her tracks and held him in her gaze. She transferred the weight of the child to one arm and pointed the other directly at him. "The man you all know as Sheriff John Lucas is a fraud." There was a wave of excited chatter around the church. "The man sitting there isn't John Lucas at all. His real name is Lucas Rochester. He is the father of this child." She paused to let the murmurs around the church die down before adding, "And he is my husband." All eyes in the church immediately fell on Lucas. Rachel looked at him, horrified. "Is this true?" "I have no idea what this woman is talking about," he blustered, directing his comments more at the mayor than Rachel. "I've never seen her before in my life." Rachel could just see from the look in his eyes that he was lying. She refused to sit next to him any longer and moved to sit beside Mary across the aisle. Mary held her hand reassuringly. The woman approached Rachel and whispered, "I am sorry to do this so publicly, but Mr. Parsons and Miss Holly and Mary said that it was the only way to help you. Miss Mary, will you take the baby a while?" Mary expertly took the child in one arm without waking it. She pulled out a piece of paper and handed it to the pastor. "That there is the marriage certificate that confirms our union. My name is Marge. Marge West, that was Marge Rochester now, although no one knows me by that name, as this man," she pointed again, "insisted that we keep our marriage a secret." "This is all lies," the sheriff declared, getting to his feet. "Sit down," Robert said, taking a step toward him. "Sit down and have the good grace and decency to let this woman tell her story. You can have a right to reply after she does so." He may have been the sheriff, but at present all of his authority was gone. He was no match for the physical presence of Robert, and so he obediently sat with a look of sheer horror on his face. "Marge, please, if you would share your story with everyone," Robert said reassuringly. Marge nodded and cleared her throat. Chapter 23. Marge had never been a particularly confident woman, and speaking before so many people was not among the accomplishments she had dreamed of, but she was fueled by anger and a sense of injustice. She had been wronged. Her child had been wronged, Another poor, unassuming young woman had been wronged. She had to stand up for what was right. My name is Marge West. Well, it was West. Technically, it's Rochester now, but we'll get to that later. I live over in Spring Creek, she began. Just over 18 months ago, I buried my poor husband, Thomas. He was a good man, Thomas, a farrier. Kept himself to himself like most good folks do. His work kept him busy, but we had no money saved. Farriers don't make much money. Anyhow, one day he just died while shoeing a horse, a seizure. He just keeled over there and died. No warning, no goodbyes. 1 minute he was there, the next he was gone. I was left with nothing but a little money to last me 2 months at most. The good Lord had not seen fit to bless us with children. At that point, I was thankful. Fewer mouths to feed, you see, she added almost apologetically. After a week of desperation, I pulled myself together and started asking around town about work. I sold Thomas's tools, and that gave me enough to last another month or so, but I knew that I would need work. I tried the inn. I told old Mrs. Rothermere, who owns it, that I would try my hand at anything. She paused and blushed, realizing how that might have sounded. Well, almost anything. I could cook, I could clean, but Mrs. Rothermere wasn't taking on staff. The town had suffered these last few years. Customers weren't as plentiful as they might be, and so she made do with what she had. But it was there on that visit that I first met Lucas Rochester, the man you all know as John Lucas. The whole congregation sat and listened to Marge in silence, enthralled by her compelling story. All except one. The sheriff wrung his hands continually in a nervous gesture. He was polite and pleasant. He was staying at the inn, he said. He had moved to town 2 weeks earlier. He was a businessman from Indiana who was looking to further his interests and portfolio out these parts. He said that if he could ever be of help, I should call on him. I thanked him for his kindness, but thought no more of it. At that point, he had no business interest here and could offer me no employment, so I had no idea what he might be thinking. I see now that I was somewhat naive. For the next week or so, I would see him around town. When I shopped in the mercantile, he was there. When I was asking about employment at the apothecary, he was there. He would take to walking around town with me. He was pleasant company, and he took my mind off my problems. It soon became clear that his interest extended beyond kindness. He had romantic intentions. My Thomas was only just buried, but in this world, we women have to look after ourselves and find our way as best we can. I began to give thought to taking another husband. It would be the solution to my financial problems. I knew that Thomas would not have been against my marrying again. He would have wanted me to be provided for. However, it seemed that Lucas here wasn't so much interested in marriage as he was in the romantic side of matters. I told him in no uncertain terms that marriage would be necessary before any of that would be occurring. A mixed round of laughter and exclamations of shock erupted around the church before everyone settled down to hear the rest of the story. He seemed to take it in good grace, and no more was said for 2 or 3 weeks. Then, out of the blue, he suggested that we get married. As casual as you like, when we bumped into each other in town. I told him I would think on the matter. 2 days later, I decided to agree. He had told stories of his business interests, and it seemed that I would be provided for like never before. When you are at your lowest ebb, you look to every saving grace. He said that we would have to keep the marriage secret for just over 2 months, something to do with a legal matter relating to a will of which he was the beneficiary in Indiana. He said it would complicate matters if the lawyers knew he was married. It seemed a simple enough reason, and so I agreed. We married in secret the very next day. He didn't move into the house with me, of course, as we were pretending that we weren't married, but he visited regularly, and we made plans for the future. I was torn between guilt at marrying again so quickly and hope for the future. I told him that he should invest some money in new clothing and try to tidy himself up a little, and I did his laundry for him. Any husband of mine would be turned out respectable, even if the town didn't know that we were married. Then, 7 weeks after our marriage, he vanished. Mrs. Rothermere at the inn said that he had paid his bill and gone, not a word of where he had gone to. More excited chatter echoed around the church, among cries of shame directed at the sheriff. I felt a fool. I kept the marriage secret. I didn't want the world to know that I had been duped. Then, 2 months after he disappeared, I came to the realization that I was with child. I knew nothing of what had become of my husband until I received a visit from Mrs. Parsons and Miss Mary here a few days ago. It was obvious to me that even though he had changed his name, we were talking about the same man. I knew I had to expose him for the bigamist that he is, so I traveled back with them and agreed to come here to tell my story today. The word bigamist hung heavy in the air. Rachel was still trying to process what it all meant. She began whispering to Mary beside her. If he was already married, then surely he wasn't free to marry me? Mary continued to rock the child. Yes, it will take a little legal work, but your marriage is technically illegal and therefore invalid. Rachel sat in silence. So I'm free? Yes, Rachel, it would appear so. She was stunned, and while she felt nothing but pity for poor Marge, she couldn't help being delighted at her own situation. Then the nerves kicked in again. Throughout the service, her mind kept wandering to Luke. She prayed that he was safe over at Whitegate Ranch. Rustlers were ruthless sorts. Anything could have happened. The sheriff stood. This is all a pack of lies. It is this woman's word against mine, and I say that I have never seen her before. Robert interjected. You can keep up the pretense if you desire, but if necessary, we can have 5 people brought over here from Spring Creek who will testify that you are the man they know as Lucas Rochester, including the man who actually married you and Marge. They can be here in under 3 days. After Mary and Holly had told Marge's story to Robert during their final night in Spring Creek, he quickly came up with a plan. They returned to see Marge and managed to persuade her to return to Whitegate Ranch with them the next day. They kept her hidden on the ranch. She took Holly's bedroom, and Holly moved in with Mary for those few nights. Just 15 minutes after Holly and Mary left the ranch, David took a third cart into town and simply waited outside the church for the service to reach its conclusion and for Marge to make her entrance. The sheriff knew he was defeated and slumped back into the pew, but his shame and humiliation weren't over yet, because at the back of the church, the door flew open again. Deputy Luke walked in, pushing before him a man with his hands bound with rope. Sorry to interrupt the service, he said, completely unaware of the events that had just occurred, but I have something very important to tell everyone. Chapter 24. Sheriff John Lucas, still smarting from his exposure as a bigamist, looked in horror at the face of the man his deputy had in custody. He didn't know his real name. He had called him Red Hawk and had met with him many times over the last 10 months. He knew he was about to be exposed for the second time in a matter of minutes. His eyes began to look around the church in a desperate attempt to seek a way out. Luke had, however, predicted this. Incidentally, before I start my story, I would just like to say that there are 2 doors to this church, both of which are being guarded by brave members of this community. The sheriff slumped lower in his pew. He knew his time had come. Luke continued his story. Earlier this week, it was brought to my attention that our sheriff, the man we all entrust to provide law and order in our town and the surrounding community, had supplied information to those cattle rustlers who have been plaguing the area for many months. Again, the church erupted into noise as people either expressed surprise at this revelation or voiced confirmation that the sheriff had been up to no good. Luke held up his hand in an attempt to silence the congregation. Please, there is more to come. After a few moments, the hush returned to the packed building as everyone was eager to hear the rest of the deputy's tale. The sheriff was overheard giving information to this man here about this wedding today. Luke pulled on the rope, making the man stumble forward. He is the leader of the gang of cattle rustlers. Luke turned his attention to his prisoner. Tell them what Sheriff Lucas told you. The man gave Luke a look filled with hate, but could do nothing but obey. If he didn't, Luke would spill the beans anyway, and he may as well bring the sheriff down with him. He told us that Whitegate Ranch would be unattended today because everyone would be at a wedding. The noise exploded again, but then fell away quickly, waiting for Luke to speak again. I took what we had learned to Robert and we laid a trap. This morning, Red Hawk and his men rode into Whitegate expecting the ranch to be deserted. My posse was waiting for them. His men are already locked in the jail, and not a single shot was fired. I brought him here because I thought the town should hear from his own mouth who supplied the information. A sudden eruption of applause arose from the congregation. Holly looked at Robert and pulled him closer. He did it. The ranch is safe. He did, Robert agreed. We have our whole future to look forward to now. The mayor took to his feet at the front. People of no hope, we have had a very eventful morning. Mr. and Mrs. Parsons, I'm sorry your happy day has been interrupted in such a fashion. Deputy, I believe that you have one more person to put in jail with that rustler. He looked down with pure contempt at the man seated next to him, the man we have known as Sheriff John Lucas. Lucas squirmed, but saw Robert take a step closer to him and decided to do nothing. I hereby strip John Lucas of his office with immediate effect. Until this town can meet and settle the matter properly, I ask Deputy Luke to assume the duties of acting sheriff. Do you all consent? There was a chorus of agreement from around the church. The mayor reached down and ripped the sheriff's badge off his shirt and handed it over to Robert, who gestured that he should present it to Luke. Excuse me for a moment, Mrs. Parsons, Robert whispered in Holly's ear. Despite the circumstances, Holly couldn't resist a grin. Mrs. Parsons, the mistress of Whitegate Ranch. She would never have thought it. Before walking toward Luke, Robert grabbed Lucas by the shirt collar and pulled him out into the aisle. Think to ruin me, did you? Now you are going away for a long time, where you'll never hurt another decent person again. He pushed him down toward Luke. David, come here and bind this criminal to the other one. Everyone watched as young David did as Robert commanded. After he had finished, Robert shook Luke by the hand. Thank you for what you did today. This town owes you a great debt. May this be one small part of its repayment. At that point, he removed the deputy's badge from Luke's chest and replaced it with that of the sheriff's. Congratulations, acting sheriff. Another loud round of applause went around the church. Robert walked back up to Holly. Now, if everyone will excuse me, I'd like to take my wife out for some air. It's getting rather hot in here. Chapter 25. Whitegate Ranch was full to bursting on the first night of Robert and Holly's union. Not only were Marge West and her child still in residence, but Rachel had also been invited. No one felt comfortable allowing her to stay in the sheriff's house after what had happened. Of course, technically, the accommodation was now Luke's, which opened up another range of problems and a whole new level of inappropriateness. Holly couldn't help laughing with Robert when they managed to get a moment alone together in the kitchen about how this wasn't the wedding night she had envisaged. There'll be plenty of nights to come, he said softly. After the wedding, Rachel had been over to the lawyer and he had confirmed that her marriage to John Lucas was null and void. The previous marriage to Marge West, despite the man using a different name, took precedence. Rachel was once again a widow and free to marry as she wished, whenever she wished. In a trice, she was free of her burden. She couldn't help but feel guilty for being free of Lucas, while poor Marge wasn't. She was stuck with a child and also a husband who had run out on her and was now in jail. However, there was little that could be done about that situation. The next morning, Marge made her way back to Spring Creek, and David was entrusted with the task of driving her. He seemed to get on well with the child, and Mary thought that one day the young man would make an excellent father. She left Whitegate Ranch with everyone's thanks, especially that of Rachel, who vowed that if she was ever in the position to do so, she would offer Marge a job. As Marge was riding off, Acting Sheriff Luke made an appearance. Howdy, folks. I thought I'd come and check everything was all right out here. You never know when criminals are involved. Everything is just fine. Thank you, Sheriff, replied Holly. Thanks to you, of course. Luke tipped his hat to her. My pleasure, ma'am. He leaped off his horse to address his real reason for being at the ranch. I was wondering if I might walk with you a moment, Miss Rachel? Rachel blushed. It would be a pleasure. Wait, said Holly, rushing inside. She came out with a little basket, which she pressed into Rachel's hand. Why don't you two go down and have breakfast by the creek? It's delightful there during the mid-morning. Holly had prepared the basket half an hour earlier and had planned to whisk her new husband away for a romantic breakfast. As Robert himself had said only the previous day, Holly knew there would be plenty of breakfast together to come. It was clear that Luke had important matters on his mind, and it made sense for him and Rachel to talk candidly about their feelings for each other. A little picnic down by the creek would be perfect for such a conversation. As she uttered a word of thanks, Holly squeezed her hand and pulled her closer. "Tell him everything," she whispered. The walk to the creek didn't take long. The few trees and rocks there offered some shelter from the sun as it climbed ever higher in the sky. Rachel laid out the little blanket, and they both sat down. "So how was your first night as sheriff?" she asked while unpacking the freshly baked bread, butter, cold ham, chicken, and cheese, before reaching for the stone flask of cold milk. It was ideal food for a romantic breakfast. "Busy," Luke laughed. "After you all left, I had a constant stream of folks coming by and offering thanks. It seemed that most of the town had a grievance against Lucas." He froze for a second, wondering if the mention of his name had upset Rachel. "None more so than you, of course." Rachel gave a shrug. "That's life, I guess. But the good news is that I am free. My marriage to him was a sham. Null and void, the lawyers say, just like it never happened at all. You know, when you stepped off that train and I saw you for the first time, I wished with all of my heart that I was there to collect you for myself," said Luke. "It almost broke me to have to take you to the sheriff and then watch you day by day, knowing you'd never be mine." Rachel brushed away a little tear. "Let me tell you a story. I can do this now because I am a widow and unmarried. When I climbed off that train and saw you, my heart sang with joy. You were everything I had imagined and hoped my new husband would be. Of course, that wasn't to be." "It could be," offered Luke nervously, "if you wanted it to be." Rachel's cheeks flushed. Of course she wanted it to be, but she had to tell him her position. She reached out and gently touched his hand. "Luke, I would like that more than anything in the world, but there is something I have to tell you." She burst into tears, knowing that once he knew that she was with child, he probably wouldn't want to know her. Young men weren't interested in bringing up other men's children. She knew that. Luke reached into his pocket and pulled out a fresh handkerchief, with which he carefully dabbed her eyes. "If you are about to tell me that you are pregnant, Miss Rachel, then let me tell you that I already know, and it doesn't bother me in the slightest." Rachel almost stopped breathing with shock. "What? How do you know that? Did Holly or Mary tell you?" Luke smiled. "No, nothing like that. The old woman I lodged with when I first came west was the midwife for miles around, and I drove her cart to every birth she attended. I grew up surrounded by women in your condition. I can spot them a mile off." Rachel's mouth hung open, stunned. "How long have you known?" "I had my suspicions for a while. You fainting in church and Doc checking you over so carefully confirmed it." "You truly don't care?" Luke shook his head. "It doesn't worry me in the slightest. I think I've loved you since I saw you at the train station. I'll love the child that you're carrying as my own if you'll let me." Rachel couldn't believe it. In a matter of hours, her fortune had changed completely. She decided that she would unburden herself completely and tell Luke everything. She didn't want the man she loved not to know everything about her. She launched into the same story she had told Holly on the train trip to No Hope: how she had been forced into marriage, how she had corresponded with Lucas in a fantasy attempt to escape, how the baby was, in fact, that of her dead husband, and how she fled shortly after his death, after she had unburdened herself of his dirty money. She also explained about her husband's brother's threats. Finally, she added how nothing had ever happened between Lucas and her while they were married, and that he had just treated her as a glorified housekeeper. When she finished, she took a long drink of milk and waited. "Is that it?" Luke asked. She flicked her hair out of her eyes. "That's everything. You know everything about me. Do you still want to marry me?" Luke smiled, more than ever. He leaned over and kissed her. Rachel felt as though her whole world had stopped. She wished for this moment to last forever. Chapter 26. 6 weeks later. Holly had woken earlier than normal and slipped out of bed as silently as possible to avoid waking Robert. She knew her husband needed rest as much as he needed food and love. Since the wedding, he had worked tirelessly on the ranch. The business contacts he had made in Spring Creek were starting to bear fruit. Already, cattle numbers and therefore profits were on the rise. Mary had fully engaged in the financial matters behind the business, and her talk was of diversification, adding crops and accommodation to their business. Holly let her husband and sister-in-law get on with the business that they all understood so well. She took control of the house. It was as she liked it. She sipped her coffee on the porch rocker and watched the sunrise. Like Robert had said on her first morning there, she also never tired of the view. Her mind drifted over to the West Wing. She had plans to rebuild it. They would need more room. At some point, she and Robert would start a family. Holly also had plans for her sister-in-law, who would make someone an excellent wife one day. There would be a need to accommodate them as well. "Penny for your thoughts," Robert said as he silently appeared behind her. Holly turned and looked lovingly at him. "Just thinking how fortunate I am." "No one is more fortunate in this world than me, my darling. I am the most blessed man in the world." "I just pray that Luke and I have a marriage like yours," Rachel said as she emerged through the door. "Sorry to intrude, I just couldn't sleep." Holly leaped up from the rocker. "How is the bride on her wedding morning?" "Somewhat nervous." She patted her stomach, which was now clearly showing signs of her pregnancy. "Plus, this little one spent most of the night kicking. He didn't seem to believe that I actually needed sleep." "You already decided it's a boy, then?" Robert laughed. "With the kick that he has got to be a boy," Rachel declared confidently. "Well, you take a seat," Holly demanded. "I'll fix you tea, then we'll get you ready." 5 hours later, Rachel was taking her vows next to Luke in the church. Unlike Holly and Robert's wedding, this wasn't a grand affair. The only people present were Holly, Robert, Mary, and Dr. Sam Coates, who had been a regular visitor to Whitegate Ranch over the last few weeks, checking on Rachel's health. This was how Rachel wanted it: quiet and intimate. They had delayed the wedding for 6 weeks, thinking it was decent and proper to do so. As the victim of a bigamous husband who had treated her like a housekeeper, however, Rachel admitted that no one really knew what was proper in this particular instance. Before the service, they had received some good news. The mayor had sent word to Luke that it had been discovered that Lucas had been married before over in Indiana. Bigamy was clearly a habit with him, and marriage was not a vow that he had treated with any respect or reverence. However, because of this, poor Marge was now also free to marry again, should she so desire. She too was free from Lucas. That was not the only shadow to have been lifted from Rachel's past. After she had told Luke everything about her first husband, he had written to the authorities back east about the threats from her brother-in-law. A reply had arrived only a few days before the wedding. The man who had shot Rachel's husband had been arrested and had confessed to the killing. Whatever accusations her brother-in-law had threatened to make against Rachel were now worthless. Better still, the authorities had been made aware of the letters in which her brother-in-law had demanded money and threatened to accuse her of murder. He had been warned that any further attempt to threaten or extort Rachel would bring attention upon himself. For the first time since leaving the East, Rachel knew there was nothing waiting behind her that she still needed to fear. 2 weeks after Holly and Robert's wedding, the town had met formally and confirmed Luke as sheriff. Rachel knew it was going to be strange returning to the house she had lived in with Lucas, but Luke had spent the last 6 weeks renovating the place as best he could. It was amazing what a little bit of paint and some tender, loving care could do. He had even removed every stick of the old furniture and replaced it. It had cost a pretty penny, but folks in the town were eager to help the new sheriff, and they did what they could to help. After the service, Rachel and Holly found themselves alone for a few moments in the square. "It took a little while, but we both got what we wanted in the end," said Holly. She looked over at their two handsome men. "We certainly did. I could have done without all the problems, though," Rachel said. Sam Coates was engaged in a discussion with Robert and Luke. "You know, we really need to get Sam a wife. He is getting too old to be a single man." "You're right, Rachel. Let's get together early next week for a good chat and catch up. I'll bring Mary. We can all play matchmaker." Rachel squeezed Holly's hand and gave her a gentle kiss on the cheek. "I'd like that very much. Who'd have thought there would be so much excitement in a little western town called No Hope?"